Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment, letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like, and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. Mindy's Playhouse. When I was around 6 or 7, maybe even 8, I had a next-door neighbor called Mindy. I had moved to a small town just north of El Dorado, Kansas, and was waiting for the new school year to start. Mindy was my age, and on one warm summer morning, she'd knocked on our door to ask if I would like to come over and play. She said she'd seen me moving in, and was delighted that another little girl had moved in on the street. She'd wanted to be my friend. After my parents' divorce, I had moved in with my dad. He was a quiet, meek man who didn't do much but garden and watch old reruns of All in the Family. My mom lost custody because of her drug abuse, and I suppose that he hadn't really known what to do with me when I'd first moved in. I hadn't lived with him in my formative years, and it was only once my grandmother got wind of things that he'd pushed to be a part of my life again, having been disillusioned that I was living in some stately house up north. I think, in the beginning at least, he wasn't prepared to start raising up a little girl, particularly one he'd last seen as a toddler. And so the option of letting me play with the girl from the nice family next door must have been a relief. A way for him to get his life in order, to step in as the dad he needed to be. And I'm grateful to say that he really, truly did. Mindy was a bit spoilt, but a good kid. From what I recall, she had long, blonde hair that her mother always tied into pigtails, and a sweet chocolate box pretty face, like Shirley Temple. I'm afraid there aren't many more details I can give on her appearance. My memory is hazy. Even when I try my best to recall her face, all I can see is a blur. But that initial feeling, that impression, still remains. She always wore the nicest clothes, and despite my reserved jealousy that she and I were not cut from the same cloth, she nevertheless tried her best to make me feel like her equal. She'd ask her mother to teach us how to bake, and her father would always let us stay up late to watch television. She'd give me her old dresses and shoes so that I'd have nice things to wear for the first day of school, which seemed to be an eternity away at that age. Although we only ever knew each other for several weeks, her memory is something I would never forget. I can't forget it. The best thing about Mindy's home was a little playhouse she had, tucked right at the end of the backyard. It was big enough for the two of us to be in, but any adult would have a hard time bending down and minding their head on the doorframe. Her grandfather had built it for her when she was just a baby, and it was truly a gorgeous thing. Cream-painted wood with a coral pinkish roof, clad with real tiles. Painted ivy and roses adorned the outdoors, and the duck-egg green door held a sweet, heart-shaped doorknob. The windows had proper glass and matching green shutters on the outside. Inside were 2 wooden stools and a toy box filled with make-believe kitchenware. A faux stove, completely covered with painted appliances, and a rocking horse in the corner. Floral curtains to draw out the light. It was every little girl's dream. And Mindy let it be mine as much as it was hers. Ours. Sometimes we'd have sleepovers in there. The door had a hatch key lock on the inside, so it felt like we really were adults, pretending to be roommates in our own grown-up apartment, telling each other stories over make-believe tea, and leaving the curtains open to stare at the stars in the sky. The warm, summer nights left us comfortable in our sleeping bags, and I truly thought I'd never be happier. My therapist says trauma can hide a lot of things from you. It's a tricky thing, leaving you with the dread and anxiety without ever revealing the extent of it all. I suppose PTSD is the phrase I should be using. My fond memories of Mindy's house are still there, untouched, untainted. Maybe my own childhood experiences with my mom didn't allow me to realize the cracks that were forming in Mindy's home. I never thought Mr. Howard was a bad man. He was nice and looked all cleaned up. He had a white-collar job, and I never considered that, with his income, he shouldn't have been living in our rundown neighborhood, let alone be my next-door neighbor. He always came home from work with a smile on his face and a kiss for his wife, and treated me as he treated Mindy. In my eyes, they were the perfect nuclear family. Compared to just me and my dad, who, bless his heart, was trying to make ends meet, they seemed so comfortable, so cozy. It was only years after that I'd come to understand the lengths some people will go to keep up a facade. What I had perceived as a healthy, happy lifestyle was nothing more than a perfectly practiced production. A play put on a stage where the actors couldn't leave. They couldn't stop playing pretend, as Mindy and I had done so many times in her playhouse. The real playhouse was their own home, and despite their food and water and appliances all being very real, they'd manufactured themselves to be nothing more than puppets on a stage. Marionettes controlled by the overwhelming desire to not let a tear slip or issue be revealed. A waltz of souls tethered to an unattainable dream. Mr. Howard was a gambler, his savings whittled away down to mere pennies in his pockets. But he never stopped his grandiose spending. Mindy always got a new gift whenever he went away for business, and Mrs. Howard was always presented with some fabulous flowers. Sometimes she'd send me home with her bouquet, telling me that she'd not need them with all the wonderful flowers he'd bought her before. She'd seen my dad gardening on the small, shameful plot of land we called a garden, and he'd always been grateful to try and plant them back there. It really was strange how it happened. Mr. Howard, despite all his flaws, loved his family. He loved them so much. But perhaps love confused him. It was only a few weeks before school when Mindy invited me around for a sleepover. It was the usual routine. Her mother made a fantastic meal, and we stayed up a bit to watch the television, laughing at whatever risque scene was portrayed past 9 p.m. Then around 10 p.m., her mother ushered up to get ready for bed, having set up our little camp in the playhouse outside. It was all the same old passage of events. Mindy and I were tucked away in the playhouse, and as we grew sleepy from chatting about God knows what, we heard a large bang. Mindy shot up and looked concerned. I was extremely tired, and, whilst rubbing my eyes, I asked her what the matter was. She didn't speak, but put a finger to her mouth, beckoning me to stay quiet. She said she'd go in and see what was happening. She left and then whispered a final few words. "Lock the door, Kelly. Don't let me in unless I say the password. Promise?" I did as she said and waited. Then, screaming. There's not much else to remember from that. My dad said that I refused to come out of the playhouse, even when the police had tried to calm me down and tell me I was okay, that I was safe. I screamed and wailed that I couldn't leave until Mindy gave me the password, that I needed to wait for Mindy to come back. A child's brain is such a fickle thing. Once I'd heard my dad's voice, I'd forgotten about any promises sworn to Mindy, and leapt out of the playhouse and into his arms, sobbing from a concoction of fear and comfort that felt oh so crushing upon the weight of my tiny shoulders. Although I was young, I wasn't stupid. I'd known what the implications of those screams were and those sounds. I knew why I was carried out through the side gate and not through the house. I knew what the men in white overalls were doing, moving in and around the property. I knew that my participation in the Howard's charade was over, and that my friend wouldn't ever come knocking on the front door of her playhouse again. Even if we wanted to, my dad and I couldn't leave. We had no money, and we were forever cursed to live next to the house of the tragedy. I started school without her, and I cried on the first day when I walked into class with an old pair of Mindy's shoes and a dress she'd given me. It never looked as nice on me as it did her. I came to learn that Mindy's grandiose tales of her popularity amongst classmates was a fairy tale. She was a nobody to them, a sad, lonely girl with no one to talk to. Perhaps that's why she'd latched onto me, someone who had it worse, or at least she thought they did. Someone she could continue to spread the plague of perfectionism passed down so unceremoniously onto her. And I wondered if her parents thought the same thing, that I wouldn't be able to see the chipped paint on the walls of their home, because mine ran so much deeper. Dad and I never really spoke about it much after I turned 10, I think. Years of therapy had taught me to repress those memories, but sometimes they pulled themselves out from the back of my scalp and grasped hold in the front of my mind. I could never truly forget it. My first friend after such a traumatic time in my life, and how wonderfully crafted it had all been. How I, in all my naivety and desperation, had been so blinded by gratitude that I took part in the illusion without any inkling to help her back. No one ever moved into Mindy's old home. It lay there derelict, and as did the playhouse at the back of the garden. I must have been 16 when I decided to try my chance at hopping the fence, to go and see the playhouse up close again. It was too hard to see from my bedroom window, though I could tell it was worse for wear. It had always fascinated me, and with a bit of Dutch courage from my dad's unlocked whiskey cabinet, I clambered over, ignoring the scrapes and splinters that mottled my palms. My dad wouldn't be back for at least a few hours, so I figured I'd be in the clear, particularly since no one dared come close to the place of such a tragedy. I started to feel uneasy as I grew closer to the playhouse. It truly was decrepit. Tiles, once vibrant and perfect, lay slathered in moss and slime. Grass, unkempt, grew into the cracked paint of the walls, and cobwebs glistened with moonlight. Wind whistled through the eroded adhesive of the windowsills, and the once gorgeous floral curtains were frayed and rotten. I remember my breath hitching. Perhaps I hadn't wanted to sully the wonderful memories that remained. Did I want to unearth the past that I'd so soundly put to sleep in my subconscious? I couldn't have dwelled on it too long. Before I knew it, my knuckles rapped on the small, faded green door. The password. Of course, there was no response. I almost laughed at myself. What was I thinking? That Mindy would suddenly pop out, jaw blown off, and ready to pounce on me for not waiting for her? A zombie to take me to the grave for breaking our promise and drag me down to the pits of hell? I started to walk away until I heard a small, meek voice. Mindy? I froze. That voice. It wasn't. Mindy, is that you? I turned, half horrified and half confused. It didn't sound like me, not how I remembered. It was too young, too small. I don't remember being that small. I knocked again, the same password. Then I heard crying. Soft, heartbroken sobs that rattled my brain. Mindy, please come back. It's me, Mindy. I couldn't stop myself. I placed a hand on the door and peered inside through the small window. I couldn't see anything but pitch, black nothingness. Can you let me in? The crying turned to some small sniffles, and after a moment, the door unlatched, creaking slightly. I pushed it open and winced from the sudden appearance of light. Despite having ducked down through the doorway, the interior of the playhouse seemed much, much larger than it did from outside. It wasn't moldy or dank, but pristine and fresh like it had once been. The small flickers of candles danced around the room, and a warm, vanilla scent danced around my nose. And nestled in the corner was a little head peeking out from under a sleeping bag, nose snotty and eyes plump and reddened with tears. Suddenly, the figure burst out from the sleeping bag and rushed toward me, wrapping arms around my torso with what felt to be relief. Mindy, you were gone for so long. I was worried. It trailed off before looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. It was me, a much smaller, scruffier version of me. From what I could tell anyway, my mind racked with images of photographs hung on Dad's fridge. Looking at them, I don't think I'd even be able to recognize my likeness in the street. I was flabbergasted and couldn't speak. That chillingly familiar scent of vanilla candles sickened me to the point of bile rushing up my throat, and I'd known that had I dared open my mouth to respond, I'd surely expel the contents of all the whiskey I'd forced down onto the clean, carpeted floor. Carpet? I never remembered the floor to be carpeted. My eyes darted around the room, cold flooding my bones despite the cozy temperature. It wasn't exactly how I'd remembered it to be. The pristine, painted interior had chips in it, and the faux stove seemed a lot more shoddily painted. The former glory of the playhouse, despite being close to the memory I held of it, was askew, amiss. Different, as if from a more grown-up lens, maturity dampening the magic that I'd conjured up in my dreams. Mindy? The small girl asked again, and she clasped my hands with her own. I looked down and saw that, unlike my tanned skin that should have bore resemblance to hers, I instead had small, pale ones, fingernails painted with a light pink sheen. I quickly pulled away, grasping at my face. My nose was smaller, pointier, lips thinner. I scrambled to the window and saw Mindy. 6 or 7, or perhaps even 8-year-old Mindy Howard staring back at me. My face wasn't mine, it was hers. My hair was pulled back into long, blonde pigtails, and my hoodie and jeans replaced with a pink pinafore dress. I looked down at the hem of the dress and noticed a slight fraying. stitching that hadn't quite been made correctly and threatened to expose the split seam. It wasn't right. Words began to tumble out of my mouth, a voice much gentler and higher pitched than my own, and didn't match the thoughts that swirled murkily in my head. My body moved on its own, and I pulled the girl, her, into my arms. "Hey, don't cry. Everything's fine. Mommy just dropped some laundry on the ground." I spoke. Mindy spoke. The girl cried softly, and after a few moments of sniffle-broken silence, she began to calm down. I continued. "Let's go to sleep now. I'm pretty tired. Mommy said she'll make us pancakes in the morning." I felt my face stretch into a small smile, and hand in hand we moved to the sleeping bags, nestling under them together. Eventually heavy breaths turned into light snores, and I looked at myself. Her and a warmth blossomed in my chest. And somehow I knew. Mindy felt a genuine love for me, for the little scruffy kid who looked at her with pure adoration. It wasn't pity or anger or anything else I had concocted up in my guilt-ridden stupor. She loved me, and she forgave me. And in that little, less-than-perfect playhouse, we could forget those bleak and colorless moments that loomed outside and be comfortable together in our own small world of make-believe. I woke up early in the morning to water dripping from the tiles in the ceiling. Vanilla was replaced with mildew and rot, and the warmth of those sleeping bags gone in favor of the icy, damp wooden floor. It had been stripped of everything entirely, just the shell of the playhouse standing around me. I stood up and hit my head on the ceiling, my jeans returned and hoodie sodden. I checked my cell phone, and it was 5 a.m., with the early morning sun peering through the dirtied windows. Yet, despite how miserable I should have been, waking up in such a decrepit place, I was in a state of bliss. Peace. I sat there for a moment, wondering if I'd been far drunker than I'd realized, and had simply passed out the moment I entered the tiny playhouse and dreamt up the entire experience. My head wasn't pounding, though, at that age. Hangovers felt like a slight headache, rather than severely crippling. My back did ache from the hard floor, and I felt a sense of foolishness wash over me. What was I doing, going into my deceased childhood friend's playhouse? Back to the site of the tragedy? It was only when I looked at my surroundings that I noticed the small scribbling on the floor, like chicken stretches but blue and waxy. It was hard to read, barely legible childish scribbles. "I'm sorry I couldn't come back. Thank you for being my friend." I sobbed for a very long time on the floor of that playhouse, not out of sorrow or dread like the last time I'd been in there. It was out of pure, absolute gratitude. I knew that, wherever Mindy was, she was finally at peace, and that rotted, tainted part of my childhood had slowly begun to repair itself, healing over like a scar that would always remain, but slowly fade. She'd saved a part of me again. A few months later, Mindy's old home was demolished. Something to do with a big buyer wanting to convert the lot into a care home. It was quite poetic, in a strange sort of way. The house of the little girl who helped me would now be the home to people who needed care in the last few stages of their life. The playhouse went too, of course, but it didn't really affect me as much as I'd thought it would. I had the fond memories to go by now, and it was better to see it removed before the image of its depleted self replaced the one frozen in my mind. I have my own home now, in a much nicer area. My husband and I are preparing for a new guest, a little baby girl, just 6 months along. My husband is quite the craftsman, and when I suggested he build a small playhouse for her to play in with her friends when she grows up, he was delighted with the idea. I can see it now, as I'm typing this from my bedroom window. Cream-painted wood with a coral pinkish roof, clad with real tiles. Painted ivy and roses adorn the outdoors, and a duck-egg green door with a sweet heart-shaped doorknob. The windows are proper glass and have matching green shutters on the outside. It's carpeted inside too. If that sent a chill down your spine, the next story will freeze you in place. I threw out my son's teddy bear, and now he's different. About a month ago, my 5-year-old son Luke became obsessed with an old teddy bear. It was falling apart, one eye missing, stuffing leaking out, but he refused to let it go. He called it Mr. Bear, though he never named it before. My wife and I decided to throw it away while Luke slept. The next morning, he woke up frantic. "Where's Mr. Bear?" he screamed, terrified. It wasn't just a normal tantrum. Luke was pale, shaking, like something terrible had happened. He kept saying, "I have to find him. He'll be mad at me." That night, things escalated. Luke didn't sleep. He started whispering to someone, pointing at the closet, saying, "He's here." I found him wide-eyed and sweating, clutching the bear's old ribbon. I know I threw that bear away, but the ribbon was back, dirty and frayed, wrapped tight around his little hands. I tried to take it, but Luke screamed, "Don't! He's watching." Later that night, I woke up to scratching. I thought it was the wind, but the sound was coming from under my bed. I leaned over, heart pounding, and saw a hand, long, pale fingers with jagged nails, reaching out from beneath the bed. Before I could move, it grabbed my ankle, ice cold and sharp. I've never felt anything so cold in my life, at least not anything living. I yanked free, pulling Luke into my arms. Clutching each other's hands, we ran for the door, but as we reached it, something slammed against it from the other side, hard. The door rattled, deep breathing echoed through the room, and claws scraped against the wood. There was something so intense about the scratching, like whatever was doing it would stop at nothing until it broke through. I turned to Luke, but he wasn't scared anymore. His face was blank. "You shouldn't have thrown him away," he whispered. The scratching stopped. I finally opened the door, pulling Luke out of the room. We stayed in the living room that night. I didn't sleep. The house was quiet, but I could still feel it, him, watching. The next morning, Luke was different. He just sat in his room, holding the bear's ribbon. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I'll bring him back." And then I noticed it. Dark, wet dirt scattered across the floor, leading from the bed to the closet. Luke looked up at me, his eyes dark, hollow. He squeezed the ribbon tightly in his fist. "You can't stop him," he said, his voice cold. "Mr. Bear's coming for you." I'm writing this from my study. The house is quiet now, too quiet. Luke hasn't made a sound in hours, and I'm too scared to check on him. The ribbon, dirt, the hand, I can still feel the cold grip on my ankle. I've locked myself in here, hoping it'll be enough. But deep down, I know it won't be. The scratching has started again, faint at first, but it's growing louder. I hear it coming from under the door, and I know what's next. There's no escape. I threw him away, and now he's coming for me. Just when you think you've heard it all, the next tale proves otherwise. I'm worried that my hometown doesn't exist. I was born in Sunset Bay, Florida, or at least I thought I was born there. I thought I was raised there, spent 17 and a half years of my life there, went to school there, had my first kiss there, and almost lost my virginity there. But now I can't even be sure. You see, as far as the world seems to be concerned, there is no such place as Sunset Bay, Florida, and there never was. Unfortunately, this story began with Hurricane Milton. As we're all well aware by now, Milton was utterly devastating for many fellow Floridians this month, and let me just say that my heart goes out to them all, well and truly. Luckily for me, though, I'd moved out of Florida with my family in 1995, just a few months before I turned 18, and I now reside in British Columbia, here in Canada. Understandably, though, when I heard that Milton made landfall in Florida, I was concerned for my hometown. I'd never been incredibly attached to Sunset Bay, and frankly, it'd been years since I'd even thought of the place. I have 2 sons and a wife, so there are more important things in my life than reminiscing about my formative years down south. However, when I learned Milton had made a pass around near Big Cypress, down by Ochapee, that got my blood pumping something fierce. You see, Sunset Bay is, or was, or maybe never was, only a handful of miles away. Naturally, I hopped on my computer when I got the chance and did some searching. I looked up Hurricane Milton Sunset Bay. At first, I was relieved to find I'd come up with 0 results. I figured that meant there hadn't been anything newsworthy there, which could have been good news in and of itself. But I was soon struck by the realization that I wasn't seeing any news about Sunset Bay because the search engine had taken the liberty of assuming I was asking about Sunset Beach, down on Treasure Island. So I tried rephrasing, Hurricane Milton Sunset Bay, Florida, Ochapee. But nothing. All I got was a handful of irrelevant pages on Sunset Beach, Siesta Key, and even Tampa. I was hit each time with a prompt asking me something like, "Did you mean Hurricane Milton Sunset Beach?" I found myself like a real old man, sitting there while verbally beginning to chew out the computer. "No," I would say. "No, not Sunset Beach, Sunset Bay." I found myself getting so fed up with what I took to be some sort of Abbott and Costello-style mix-up that I ended up trying to soothe my seething self by simply typing in Sunset Bay, with the hope that'd get me somewhere. But to my shock and severe annoyance, I found myself yet again redirected to Sunset Beach. For context, Sunset Beach is a whole 5 or so hours from where Sunset Bay should be. They are not the same place in any sense of the word. I found myself seething even further, typing in Sunset Bay into my search bar with every sort of permutation I could think of. Sunset Bay, Florida, Sunset Bay, Florida, Sunset Bay, United States, Sunset Bay, Okeechobee, Florida, United States, but never got a single result. By then I was livid, but I was also determined to beat the computer, as dumb as that sounds, to get the results I was looking for. Call me stupid, call me stubborn, call the endeavor pointless. I simply wanted it to work, once. But it never worked, not even once. Not even a hint of acknowledgement that Sunset Bay ever existed. Not even Google Maps would acknowledge its existence. Believe me? I tried. Eventually, it got to the point where I figured that the only way to get this damn thing working would be to stop looking up Sunset Bay itself, and instead look up some specific place in Sunset Bay that may have some sort of website, maybe online reviews, maybe a blog post, something, anything. So I took a pause, rolled back from the desk, furrowed my brow, and got to thinking. I tried to think of where the most significant, internet-worthy place from back home might be, but the moment the neurons began firing off in my mind, I was struck with a pain so intense I can hardly even describe it. I'd imagine it felt like how it would feel if your skull was cleaved apart with an axe and then boiling pitch was poured into the gaping wound. I screamed my lungs out, grabbed my head with both hands, and came careening down onto the floor, gasping and panting like a drowning man. The world felt like it was going out of focus, but, my ear on the ground, I could hear the dull footsteps of my eldest son running into the room, followed shortly by my wife, as they hoisted me onto my feet as best they could. They asked me what was wrong and why I had shouted, and I could only respond by telling them it was probably nothing, just a bad headache. Even so, my wife, who has some sort of sick addiction to these medical channels on YouTube, made me promise to see a doctor because she told me there was something called thunderclap headaches, and they could be a sign of something really dangerous. Before you ask, no, I haven't gone yet, but I'm booked in for next week with my GP. To my relief, it seemed as though as soon as the subject was changed and my mind drifted back from the vague memories of my hometown, I felt good as new again, as though nothing had even happened. I gave my family reassurances as best as I could, gave my wife a quick kiss and my son a hug, and placed myself firmly back down in my chair. I was back in the saddle, and I hadn't been bested yet. Piece of shit, I murmured as I slapped the keyboard, looking up to see my wife, hand outstretched with some Tylenol for me, to whom I quickly clarified that the computer was the piece of shit, not her. She gave me a quick, understanding chuckle, and left, leaving me alone once again with my new arch-nemesis, the computer. However, it only took me a few more failed searches to get utterly fed up, and when to hell with it, later I was storming out of the room, throwing in the metaphorical towel. I had better things to do with my time, or so I thought. Because, that night, as I lay in bed, I found myself grumbling, huffing and puffing to myself, like a candy-deprived child about the whole debacle. However, the more I ran over the whole situation in my mind, the more my frustration began to morph into unease, and the more thoughts like, why the hell couldn't I find anything about Sunset Bay? 2. Why couldn't I find anything about Sunset Bay? Surely it's an abnormal occurrence for a town with a public school, thousands of residents, and several notable businesses to simply disappear, not just from the map, but from the veritable neo-library of Alexandria that is the internet, right? I couldn't take it anymore. My annoyance had morphed into an overwhelming sense of dread, and I found myself in desperate need of some assurance that this was all some huge mistake. So I went digging, not through the computer this time, but through an old wicker cabinet by the edge of the bed full of keepsakes and mementos. After a few moments of searching, I found what I was looking for. My middle school yearbook from Sunset Bay Public School, an incredibly creative name, trust me, I know. To not wake my wife, I slipped away with the book back into my office, cracked it open across the desk like some sort of ancient scroll, and found my dread quickly turning to terror. There I was. My page was bookmarked. And to my right should have been Brock Tanner, but I found my greasy, pimple-pocked face next to a pale gray square, and below, where the name should have been, was an amorphous black smudge like the ink had been nearly rubbed out with a cloth. A misprint, maybe? I thought so, but I became less and less certain the more laminated pages I turned, finding myself faced with an ocean of gray squares and black smudges swirling into a blobby mess like a horrifying Rorschach test, occasionally broken up by a calm, unbothered young face on whom the horror of this whole ordeal was understandably lost. Eyes glued to the page, I found myself fumbling for the landline, dialing the school's phone number as if from muscle memory from all those days playing hooky as a kid. It never even crossed my mind that even if this was all some huge misunderstanding, they'd certainly be closed in the dead of night. But the phone rang. It rang, and then it rang again, but a little softer and softer still. The quivering sounds of the line grew faint and distant, quieter still, as though the phone were being dropped down a bottomless pit, falling away until it was entirely indistinct. I nearly screamed in surprise when breaking up the dead silence. A robotic voice boomed, crackling and monotone, telling me the call was unable to be completed as dialed, before booting me out, leaving me right back where I started, eyes wild, panting in distress, fists clenched on the arms of my chair. Mackenzie, I stammered to myself in a fervor now, glancing down at the face of Mackenzie Connors, one of the few remaining human buoys in the ocean of nothingness, which glared back at me from the page. I went right to the computer, booted it up, and typed in Mackenzie Connors, Sunset Bay, Florida. And to my surprise and delighted relief, I was able to find what seemed to be her LinkedIn page, which, while having no visible mention of Sunset Bay, did mention that she was from Florida. And she looked to be about the right build and age to be her. Once again, I failed to consider that it was the middle of the night, and may very well be wherever Mackenzie was now, but I needed this. I needed to hear someone's voice, someone from back home. I didn't even have an excuse for calling. The best I could think of was maybe something about the oddity of the yearbook, but the line connected before I could think of any better. Hudson Tech Solutions, Mackenzie speaking. How may I help you? Hey, Mackenzie, I asked, the awkwardness of this whole situation beginning to dawn on me. Yes, how may I help you, sir? I apologize if I've got the wrong person here, but did you happen to go to school in Sunset Bay, Florida? Excuse me? Did I? I heard her begin before my ears were utterly assaulted by a horrifying, high-pitched scream from the phone's speaker, so shrill and intense I worried it would tear the thing to bits, along with the grating sound of shattering glass. Mackenzie? I tried to remain calm, my head beginning to throb through the dullness of the painkillers. Mackenzie, are you okay? No reply. I sat wide-eyed in horror as the line seemed to briefly go dead before I could hear the sound of quiet, murmuring voices and approaching footsteps, as I assumed people began to barge into her room. Hey, Mackenzie, are you all right? One voice asked. Did someone scream? Another timidly inquired. Shit, she's on the ground! She's on the ground! A woman shrieked. Let go of the phone. Let go of the... Another implored feverishly before the line went dead, leaving me in stunned silence with the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I was mortified. I couldn't do anything but set the phone down on the table, not even the receiver, and shuffle, milky-eyed, back to the bedroom, whereupon I slid under the covers and shuffled up to my wife. As though by wrapping my arms around her, I was trying to confirm to myself that I did exist, and things did make sense. I wish I had more to tell you, but as of now, this is where I'm at. I sincerely hope someone can help me here, because I have not, for the life of me, been able to find any external references to my hometown, and every time I try and think real hard about it, it feels like my head is going to implode or explode or shatter into a million pieces. Can someone please help me? Thought that was unsettling? Brace yourself, the next one goes even deeper into the dark. My friends and I found the secret sidewalk. Hollywood loves remakes. That's because Hollywood itself is a remake. Close your eyes and imagine a silent film. I bet you're seeing Charlie Chaplin in all of his black and white greatness. But what you might not realize is this movie you're picturing doesn't take place in Los Angeles. It's actually 350 miles north in Niles Canyon, America's first Hollywood. Niles is nestled between the base of sprawling foothills and sits at the outside edge of the San Francisco Bay's marine layer. It's a quaint little neighborhood, one that remained frozen in the era of its former glory. A classic Americana Main Street serves as an anchor to craftsman and Victorian-style homes. At the end of Niles Boulevard is the Silent Film Museum, honoring the area's historic past life. And in the hillside that overlooks the retired train station, you'll see big white letters reading Niles, in the same style Hollywood made iconic. Niles has always been connected with something darker, though. For how small the area is, there has been a surprisingly high amount of death, mostly due to the winding one-way lane roads that run through the steep hills. Naturally, this has spawned a lot of urban legends, like the one about a girl who walks the canyon road at night, asking for a ride back home to San Francisco, only to disappear before getting there. Or the tales about the White Witch in the woods, and the stories about mysterious societies that meet under midnight's obscurity. Hell, there's even sightings of Charlie Chaplin's ghost. This is my personal favorite because witnesses always claim to see him in grayscale and moving at 16 frames per second. I think every town that is old enough has this kind of lore. Where I figure Niles is a bit different, though, is that it is home to the secret sidewalk. Deep in the foothills is what is known as the secret sidewalk, a long and mysterious stretch of cement that slithers through the hills for miles. It's hard to get to, and is one of those kind of places that's passed down from one generation of young people to the next. A place that you hear your friend's older brother bragging about for years before they get too old for it, and finally shows you how to get to it. Some of my favorite memories were the days my friends and I would ditch 6th period, fill a backpack with beer, and spend all day wandering the sidewalk. What the quote-unquote sidewalk actually is an aqueduct that used to carry water from the bay to local reservoirs. Long dried up and out of service, it now rests covered in graffiti with multiple openings pried ajar, turning the square cement structure into hollow tunnels for urban explorers or anyone brave enough to go in. I can't lie, there actually is a pretty weird feeling when you walk the sidewalk. An adrenaline boost. I don't know if it's the fact that you're legally not supposed to be there, or the suspended train track bridge you have to cross to get to it, or the silent absence of everyday bustle, but the feeling of vulnerability is palpable and hangs in the air. If you go at the right time of year, fog spills down the hill, crevices like fingers reaching out for the lower canyon, adding to the eeriness of it. Earlier I said that it's what is known as the secret sidewalk. That's because it's not the real one. I know this because my friends and I regrettably found the real one a few years ago. The guys and I were far removed from our teenage youth, and, to be honest, at this point we were too old to still be going there. But we were all together and feeling nostalgic, so we decided to go. We were about an hour or so into the hike, and disappointingly, nothing too memorable was happening. The sidewalk was still there, as it always was, but now it was without our names adorning the sides of it in bright, obnoxiously bad spray-painted fonts. Our names now entombed under the brighter, more obnoxiously bad, spray-painted fonts of Generation Alpha and Z before them. The initial rush of adrenaline had worn off, and I forget who finally said it, but we all agreed to call it and head back. I think it was less boredom and more so that we felt a little embarrassed at how immature it all was. I mean, we were closer in age to being the people who say, "Aren't you a little old to be trick-or-treating?" than the people who were a little old to be trick-or-treating. So, in a collective moment of clarity, we realized that we shouldn't have been doing what we were doing. My friend had to piss before we left, which didn't help our immaturity-rooted insecurities. But he went off to the side to handle his business regardless. We had explored the secret sidewalk at least 100 times and felt pretty comfortable knowing our way around. I say this because my friend came back and said he saw something that he had never seen there before. Being the aforementioned stupid men that we were, we couldn't resist checking it out. Through the shrubbery, you could see what looked like a sidewalk on the other side. A real sidewalk, not an aqueduct. Overgrown and beaten, sure, but there was definitely cobble-looking stones joined together, forming a walkway. We joked and named it the super-duper secret sidewalk. We decided that we didn't invest years of our life exploring here to not see where it led to. We pushed the branches aside and started to walk it. Walking on this man-made structure in the middle of the wilderness felt unnatural, but the fact that it wasn't destroyed by asshole kids made it feel unexplored by anyone else. That excited us. We all were kind of giddy at the thought of actually discovering something. Usually, all you found out there was crushed natty ice cans and the occasional unwrapped condom. This was best case scenario to us because it was new and also not an unwrapped condom. Every now and then we'd actually see signs that we weren't the first to walk this path. An occasional sweater or a beanie and even a single shoe could be found laying off to the side of the sidewalk. At first, I weirdly found comfort in the discarded clothes. It made me feel less alone that someone had done this before, if that makes sense. Like trail markers reminding you that what's ahead has been formerly walked. But the further we got, the more that feeling changed. I didn't clock it at first because of how smoothed down they were, but what I originally thought was cobblestone didn't actually seem to be. It was subtle, but every now and then I'd catch it. Etched in stone were letters and numbers. They were hard to see because the stones were laid out in mosaic fashion. If you just looked at one piece, you could assume they were just scratches. But when you looked at multiple, it became clearer. We were walking on a path made of shattered headstones. At this point, I noticed that we were growing increasingly irritable. At first, I thought some of us were just tired or hangry, but it got to the point that it was what I would call irrational. Everything seemed heightened and annoying. I actually ended up snapping at one of my friends for dragging their feet and kicking up too much dust. That kind of thing never bugs me. But for some reason, it did in that moment, and I couldn't help it. I wasn't the only one either. Simple bickering turned into heated arguments and deep cuts. Our innocent day of nostalgia had become a chore to get through. In retrospect, it's strange because we were clearly not feeling right. But not once did we talk about turning around and leaving like we planned to previously. Something was luring us deeper. Finally, we rounded a bend that ended up revealing the last bit of sidewalk, just faded away into a big empty field. It felt incredibly anticlimactic. You know the reaction some people have when a movie cuts to black and doesn't stick the landing? The "that's it" kind of feeling? That's how we felt. I think one of us might have even said that out loud. We walked who knows how far, and all we got was a lousy field to show for it. The hills surrounded the field, almost like a cove or a cul-de-sac. Crunchy yellow grass carpeted the ground. In the middle was one giant, lifeless tree, which was weird because it was late spring after a really good rainy season, but this tree only wore rigid and empty branches. Once we shook the initial feeling of disappointment, we noticed what looked like pieces of old wood strewn about. Not like fallen branches, but more so resembling posts or panels. We felt obligated at this point to investigate it. As soon as we stepped off the path, the air changed, almost a subtle pressurized feeling. The wood was clearly from some sort of shelter structure. I couldn't tell if it was enough to be a house or a hut, but it looked extremely weathered and almost half of the pieces were charred. My friends were trying to puzzle the wood back together, but I couldn't look away from the tree. One branch in particular. I can't explain why I was drawn to it. I was standing right under it and almost transfixed. The harder I looked, the more I could hear a sound coming from it, which didn't make sense because it wasn't a windy day, the tree wasn't visibly moving, but I could 100% hear a sound, like a back and forth type of sound, like a swaying that was speaking to me. A minute or an hour could have passed and I wouldn't have known. I lost track. I was so locked onto the tree that I hadn't even noticed my friends heading back to the trail. I don't know if I ever would have noticed, if not for their voices calling my name. When I looked at them, I saw each one of their faces slowly morph into a confused worry. They weren't looking at me, but around me. Like when you're talking to someone and they're looking just above your eye or something. It didn't seem like any of them were looking at the same thing either. I followed eye lines and couldn't figure out what they were looking at. There wasn't anything there. I rejoined the group and no one said a word. I asked what they were looking at and I couldn't get a straight answer from anyone. It was all, I don't knows and nothings. I don't think anyone wanted to sound like the crazy one. So, like every other expedition we had ever completed, we just left, very unceremoniously. Just headed back to our everyday lives like nothing happened. Before getting too far, I felt the sudden urge to sneak one last peek at the field. I can't say for sure what it was, but I know that I saw something. I think we all did, in our own way. To me, it looked like a fuzzy black shadow with two piercing, reflective, eye-like dots, like three-dimensional shaped TV static or a dark smudge on a pair of glasses. Almost like a translucent Rorschach test. You could probably draw any conclusion that you wanted to as to what you were seeing. I still haven't quite figured it out. What I do know is that something was under that tree when I looked back. I know that much. I don't know exactly what it was, but I don't believe that it was of this world. Before the silent film era took over Niles, the land was home to Spanish missions and the Ohlone tribe. So who knows what kind of unfortunate entities are blood-bound to those hills. My friends and I never really talked about that day ever again. I tried, but it was like pulling teeth. Every now and then, I'd get a crumb of what someone saw, or a retelling of what a friend told another friend they saw. Oddly, it didn't seem like any of us had the same experience. No one else saw the single figure under the tree like I did. Some even said they saw multiple silhouettes. Two big ones off to the side, or a big one and a couple of small ones linked together, or groups of them clashing. None, if it made sense to me. How could we all share a completely different experience of the same thing? I should have known something was wrong, though, because we are a reminiscing kind of group. We never hesitated to tell a story we've told or heard 1,000 times. But a hidden sidewalk and strange figures in a field didn't warrant at least a couple million retellings? It never sat right with me. Our friendships weren't the same afterward. Slowly, we stopped hanging out as much and talked even less. No one ever tried to give a reason as to why, either. We just accepted it as the way life moves. Friends got married, started families, chased careers, and had less and less time for each other until our friendships dwindled. One by one, my friends started to move away. One to Texas, another to Minnesota, one went to Idaho, and one even landed in Hollywood. I believe the field pulled us there. Some days, I could feel it pulling me back. I'm sure they felt it too. I wouldn't know because they never talked to me about it. When they started moving away, it always seemed like they were trying to get as far away from it as they could, like they were trying to escape something. I didn't. I'm still here, and most days when I'm feeling lonely and miss my best friends, I try to replay my favorite memories of them in my head. But now when I do, I don't hear my friends anymore. All I'm able to hear is the slow, back and forth creaking of that tree branch. If that story made you jump, the next one might make you look over your shoulder. I still can't shake that day from my memory. It hangs on, lurking in the back of my mind like some dark stain that no amount of light can bleach out. I don't talk about it much. People wouldn't believe me anyway. But some nights, especially in the dead of winter, I swear I can feel it, like something cold and invisible brushing against my neck. My name is Tom, and back in January 2003, I was working as a park ranger up in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. I'd been there about 4 years by then, and let me tell you, I loved it. The mountains, the vast quiet of the wilderness, the animals that wandered through, it all felt like home. But that winter, well, things had changed. My older brother Sam had died not even 2 months before. A hunting accident, they said. A freak accident. He'd gone out to the woods just like he had 100 times before, only this time he didn't come back. His body was found a day later, frozen and still, with what looked like claw marks deep in his chest. The coroner told me they'd likely come from a bear, though the bite patterns weren't quite a match. Grief doesn't make sense, they say, but that didn't make it easier. I went back to work to keep my mind off of it, but every snow-covered trail reminded me of him. Every bare branch seemed to reach out with an eerie familiarity. On January 7th, it had snowed lightly throughout the day, leaving a fresh blanket over everything. Snow muffles sound in a strange way, you know? Makes the world feel still, almost like it's waiting for something. I was doing a routine sweep on one of the lesser-used trails just before sunset. The air was icy, sharp enough to hurt when you breathed in deep, and there wasn't a single soul out there besides me. It was the kind of cold that burrowed under your skin, making you wish for a fire or a hot drink. I'd walked that trail dozens of times, but that day there was this feeling, an itch at the back of my neck, like someone or something was watching me. Then I saw it, or rather, them. Claw marks, massive ones, etched deep into the snow along the side of the trail. They were spaced in a way that didn't make any sense, too wide for any animal I knew. I knelt down to inspect them, my fingers brushing the edges of the grooves in the snow. They were sharp, precise, as if something had dragged enormous claws through the snow with a deliberate force. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. There was an old legend among the park rangers, one we'd all heard at least once around campfires or on late-night shifts. They called it the Winter Wraith. The story went that a ghostly figure would appear in the snow to those grieving a lost loved one, especially if that loved one had died in the mountains. It would stalk them, luring them deeper into the forest, sometimes calling out their name. And if you saw it, well, you were never supposed to follow. I shook the thought off as nonsense. Just campfire tales to spook the new rangers, right? But as I kept walking, that prickling feeling grew stronger. I could feel eyes on me, something close but unseen. And then I saw it, a trail of dark red leading through the snow. It wasn't fresh blood, but it wasn't fully frozen either. My heart was pounding as I followed it, my footsteps crunching in the snow, somehow impossibly loud in that silent landscape. The blood led me down a narrow path that I hadn't noticed before, veering off from the main trail. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave well enough alone. But grief does strange things to a man, makes him look for answers where there might not be any. The path twisted and turned, taking me deeper into the woods where the snow clung to the trees in heavy blankets. Then I saw something ahead of me, something that made my blood run cold. It was a figure, cloaked in white, almost blending into the snow. It stood motionless, as if waiting. Sam? The name slipped out before I could stop it. The figure turned, and I swear it was him. I could see the same high cheekbones, the same dark hair as my brother, but his skin was pale, almost lifeless. I stumbled forward a few steps, my heart hammering as the figure beckoned me closer. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just waited, with an expression on its face that I couldn't read. Was it smiling, crying? It was something in between, something that unsettled me to my core. I took another step, and another. The snow grew thicker, the trees denser, the cold bit deeper, a chill that felt almost unnatural. And then, in one horrible, sharp moment, I realized where the figure was leading me. Right to the edge of a steep precipice, the rocks below half covered by snow, jagged and deadly. The figure raised its hand, a thin, pale finger pointing down toward the abyss. I took a step back, my boots slipping on the ice. For a moment it looked at me, and a grin spread across its face, a grin that was too wide, too empty. Its eyes were hollow, dark, and lifeless, like staring into the void. That's when I felt it, a hand, cold and clammy, gripping my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. I staggered backward, my boot catching on a rock, and for a split second I felt myself tilting, tipping toward the edge. I reached out instinctively, and my hand brushed something solid. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The figure was gone. I managed to catch myself before I went over, falling hard into the snow, gasping and shaking. I scrambled back, my eyes darting around the forest, but there was nothing, only the endless snow and the faint outline of those giant claw marks trailing off into the trees. I don't know how long I sat there, heart racing, waiting for something else to happen. But the forest was silent, the snow falling softly, hiding the blood trail, covering the claw marks, erasing any trace that anything had been there at all. I never went back to that trail again. Every year, when winter comes around, I think of that figure in the snow, the one with my brother's face, and that wide, empty grin. And some nights, when the world is silent and still, I can almost feel that cold, ghostly hand on my shoulder, pulling me back to the edge. I don't know what it was that I saw that day. I don't know if it was real or if grief had twisted my mind into seeing things. But one thing is certain, that trail, those mountains, they hold things darker and colder than anyone could imagine. If you're feeling uneasy now, the next tale might be too much to bear. May 14, 2018. The story I'm about to tell you happened to me, and even now, years later, I'm not entirely sure what I experienced that day. People have asked me to tell it again and again, and each time I relive it, I still feel that bone-chilling dread. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here to tell you what happened and let you draw your own conclusions. I work as a park ranger, stationed around Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin. It's a vast swamp filled with gnarled cypress trees, quiet waters, and the thick, soupy air that seems to cling to you like a second skin. Some people find swamps eerie, but I've always been drawn to their strange beauty. The silence, the solitude, there's something calming about it. That was until the day I encountered her. It was a humid morning, typical for May in the basin. The air was thick, and a faint mist floated just above the water, weaving around the roots and the knees of the old cypress trees. My shift was supposed to be routine. A quick patrol through a section of the swamp, check for any signs of trespassers, illegal hunters, that sort of thing. As I made my way through the murky waters, I remembered an old tale some of the locals had told me. A story I'd always thought of as a campfire ghost tale, nothing more. The story was about a woman they called the Swamp's Bride. The tale goes that a young woman, heartbroken on her wedding day, had run into the swamp, her gown trailing behind her, and was never seen again. They say her spirit wanders the swamp, waiting for the groom who never arrived. Folks claim to hear her singing sometimes, or catch a glimpse of white in the shadows. I'd heard the story plenty of times, but it never stuck with me as anything more than folklore. Around midday, I decided to stop by a familiar clearing, a spot where a fallen tree made for a decent resting place. I took a seat, breathing in the damp, earthy scent, when something odd caught my eye. Just a few feet away, snagged on a low-hanging branch, was something white, stained, and frayed. I got up, squinting as I walked closer, and realized it was a piece of cloth. It wasn't just any cloth, though. It looked like part of a dress. Curiosity got the best of me, so I reached out and gently tugged at it. It was damp, rotting, and the fabric almost fell apart in my hands. But that wasn't the weirdest part. It looked like a piece of lace, the kind you might see on a wedding dress. I told myself it was probably some kind of prank, maybe left by teenagers trying to scare people. I put it out of my mind and turned back to continue my patrol. But as I moved away from the clearing, I thought I heard something faint, almost like a voice carrying through the trees. It was so soft, so distant, that I told myself it was just the breeze playing tricks. But then I heard it again, an eerie, melodic sound like someone humming a lullaby. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to shake it off, chalk it up to the sounds of the swamp. But the melody got clearer, closer. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone sounded sad. It was unlike anything I'd heard before. Something inside me whispered that I should leave, that I shouldn't follow that sound. But against my better judgment, I found myself moving toward it, deeper into the swamp. The mist was thicker in this part of the basin, and every step felt heavy, like the mud was trying to pull me down. The humming grew louder, echoing off the trees, filling the air around me. And then I saw something in the distance, a figure in white, standing by the water, half hidden by the fog. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe someone in trouble. But as I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't moving. She was just standing there, still as a statue, her back turned to me. The sight made my stomach twist. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I took another step forward, and that's when I noticed the dress. It was the same stained white lace, rotting and torn, draped over her figure. A veil covered her face, hanging limp and wet. Her hair, dark and tangled, dripped with swamp water. I froze, unable to look away. The humming had stopped, replaced by a thick silence. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly turned to face me. I couldn't see her face beneath the veil, but I could feel her gaze, cold and heavy, like an anchor pulling me down. Before I could react, something wrapped around my ankle, a hand, cold and clammy, clawing at me from beneath the water. I stumbled, trying to pull free, but the grip tightened, yanking me down into the mud. I looked down, and I swear I saw another hand, then another, reaching up from beneath the murky water, all clawing, pulling me toward her. Panic surged through me as I struggled, feeling the mud sucking me down. My breathing became frantic, each gasp filling my lungs with the damp, decaying smell of the swamp. I looked up, hoping to see the figure gone, but she was closer, gliding toward me, her pale, skeletal hands reaching out. I closed my eyes, bracing for her touch, the icy chill already seeping into my bones. But then, everything went silent. I opened my eyes, and she was gone. The hands that had held me down were gone too. I scrambled to my feet, breathing heavily, and staggered back to the path, too terrified to look back. I don't remember how I made it back to my truck that day. I just remember the feeling of her gaze following me, like she was still waiting, still searching. Even now, I still patrol the basin. But every time I pass that clearing, I feel the weight of her presence. Some nights, I hear the faint sound of humming drifting through the trees, and I know she's still there, waiting for someone to join her in the depths of the swamp. And if you ever find yourself out there in the mist, just remember, if you hear singing, turn back, because some things in the swamp aren't meant to be disturbed. You thought that was a nightmare? Just wait, because this next one is much worse. I was hired fresh out of college at the ripe age of 22. I had gone to school hoping to become the next big thing, this generation's Stephen King. Instead, my aspirations dwindled toward the end of college. Hell, I would have been happy to work a regular 9-to-5 writing job at that point. What happened? Well, the ideas I did have came slowly, and the ones I did have didn't garner much attention. The few drafts I sent to publishers couldn't hold them for a few chapters, let alone a whole novel. The feedback was all the same. I was stuck on non-important details, and my description of events didn't move the story forward, leaving the reader unengaged. The signature style I like using in my writing turned out to be too dry for a mainline audience. With no novel, job, or plan after college, I was reaching the bottom of the barrel. Things were looking bleak. That is until I attended a last-minute job fair a month before graduation. I was recruited by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the job title that was proposed to me was data entry. At the time, I couldn't help but scoff at the idea that the 4 long years I spent on my undergrad qualified me to fill out Excel spreadsheets. But I couldn't be more wrong. My role, or specialization as they like to call it, turned out to be more defined as audio and video interpretation. For the first 6 years of my career, I worked under a senior video and sound engineer, VSE, who helped train me in the process of transcribing video-audio evidence. The transcription work at that level was mainly ransom demands for wealthy families and petty crime footage. Would you be surprised that most ransom demands come from within the family of the victim? As for the petty crimes, they were mostly solved by the time we made our input. After 6 years, I moved on to video evidence from cold case files from the 80s, 90s, transcribing and documenting anything that may have been missed by the original detectives. This was easily the most satisfying work I have done in my career. My department managed to shine a light on evidence never before analyzed in multiple cases. Hell, we managed to drum up new leads on about 35 cold cases and help close 2, one of which had aired on Unsolved Mysteries. I am a sucker for those types of shows. The success I found in that department rocketed me into multiple opportunities. Ultimately, I began leading task forces specializing in video and sound analysis. My department had partnered with Homeland Security, focusing on potential domestic threats. I led groups that analyzed cartel and terrorist footage, and the work we did saved countless lives. With this level of work, security and secrecy were of the utmost importance. My security clearance had shot up significantly, which helped me into my next role, which I currently am at. About 5 years ago, I was approached internally by an unnamed group within the FBI, hoping to recruit me in the hopes I would lead a task force to tackle unexplained or unnatural video-audio evidence. This group was later named Unexplained Phenomenon Specialized Task Force, or UPSTF, The FBI, or any government agency for that matter, is notorious for bad names. I accepted and have been the lead director for UPSTF for the past 5 years. Although the initial work we did seemed fruitful, we eventually hit many roadblocks with the submitted evidence. We had little success explaining anything we managed to get our hands on. Eventually, with no results, the Bureau had a hard time justifying our budget. Our once thriving task force dwindled to just about 5 or so people over the past 2 years. The work we do now is more of a documentation process, and in all actuality, we have reverted to what I was doing when I first started, transcribing video and audio evidence. Believe it or not, the FBI largely lives in the past, and archaic systems still thrive. All transcriptions are typed out, printed, placed in a manila folder, then placed in a box, a strip of painter's tape slapped on the outside of the box, named based on the case file, dated, and thrown onto a shelf. The official name for this process is known as transcribing documentation through text narrative based on audio and visual interpretation through specialized extrapolation. Again, really? My coworkers and I have shortened this wonderful name down to text narrative. We have provided text narrative to thousands of cases over the past 5 years. The evidence which we transcribe will never see the light of day. Multiple layers of red tape stand in the way. Although the video and audio evidence will never see the light of day, the text narrative remains and is largely declassified. Why would these be declassified? Well, the higher-ups at the Bureau have their reasons, but I think it came down to funding and believability. Additionally, the slow nature of bureaucracy and little transparency to the public will probably provide enough cover for these documents to never leave the shelf they live on. How long would a Freedom of Information Act request really take? Years? Decades? Who knows? This is what your taxes pay for, is it not? Anyway, although my department knocks on death's door, I feel the urge, no, the need, to share this with fellow Americans. The text narrative we have done over the years shares insight into the nature of this world that no one would believe. The shit that they are hiding, it's unfathomable. Hopefully, this reaches the right audience. I can't just copy and paste these since they are all on paper, but I can type them out for now. Goody. The following excerpt is one of the stranger cases we reviewed, and one of the first we had done with the assistance of AI. Take what you will from this case and make your own decision with what was documented in this text narrative. Text narrative number 4443. The disappearance of Corey Phillips, Bremer Bay Police video and audio evidence dated 10/22/2023. Ongoing supporting case evidence submitted by Trooper Bill Hatchers of Bremer Bay Police. Visual analysis documented by licensed video and sound engineer via Sally Stromberg with audio excerpts interpreted by OpenText AI. Additional note from ASE, OpenText AI helps capture all audio with detail and accuracy. All text excerpts from subjects are captured as pronounced for complete documentation sufficient for criminal investigations and transcription purposes. Personal note from ASC to UPSTF director can be omitted in the final report. This greatly helps capture the authenticity of voice distinction, need to use on future transcriptions, or even update past completed text narratives. Start 10/21/2023 through 5:32 p.m. The video starts with a close-up shot of the face of a child. The camera is manually zoomed backward from the boyish face. The shot is now wide on the face of a young boy in a mowed yard. A camera strap extends from the camera around the boy's neck as the boy holds the camera out far facing himself. Notable identifying features of the young boy: Caucasian, short brown hair, blue eyes, red Mickey Mouse shirt. ASE identifies this child as the missing boy on file, Corey Phillips, age 7, per the case record. The sun positioning and shadow geometry of key background details confirm the camera date and time as accurate. There is a red house that fills the backdrop behind Corey. A wraparound wood back porch leads to an open sliding glass door to the residence. All indicators show this is the Phillips residence per case crime scene photography. Corey, all right guys, you are not going to believe this. My parents gave me their old camera. It's ancient. Corey proceeds to dance and spin with the camera, giggling in the last few hours of sunlight. The camera then flips around to face the open sliding glass door. Corey runs up the back steps of the porch, and through the back door. The back door opens to a modernized kitchen with a granite-topped kitchen island. A slender man and woman stand at the edges of the kitchen island, working busily at something out of sight from the camera. It is safe to conclude it is most likely dinner prep or the breakdown following dinner. Identifying features: man, Caucasian, tall, brown hair, white dress shirt, denim jeans. ASC identifies this man as suspect 1, Kenneth Ken Phillips, age 43, per the case record. Identifying features: woman, Caucasian, average height, red hair, red dress. ASC identifies this woman as suspect Caroline Phillips, age 41, per the case record. Corey, Dad, can you film me running at Thuperthapede? Not now, little man. Your mother and I are getting ready for date night. You remember that, don't you? But Dad, how am I supposed to know how fat I really am? Corey, have you still not showered? Your gam is going to be here in 30 minutes, and you need to be washed up before she arrives. Mom, I don't want. The camera faces the ground and the video cuts to black. Video end 10/21/2023, 6:39 p.m. Video resumes. The camera is aimed between wooden banisters along a stairway railing, looking down from atop a set of stairs. Corey seems to be crouched with the camera. Caroline can be seen standing next to an older woman. They are mid-conversation. Identifying features: older woman, Caucasian, short, long gray hair, blue nightgown. AS identifies this woman as suspect 3, Susan Walker, age 75, per the case record. So the opening ceremony is very important to the elders, dear. You mustn't forget the ceremony steps. The elders are very strict. Caroline: yes, Mother, I know. You do not need to worry. But, Mother, I am still scared. I can't help but remember what happened to Sean. It keeps me up at night. I can still hear his scream. Sean was careless. He did not take it seriously and paid the consequences. You are nothing like your brother. Do not embarrass your father and me as your brother did. Mom, how can you talk about your own son like that? I just don't see how Ken. Han, we're going to be late. Are you ready? I am about to come down. Please start the car. Yes, it's already started. I still need to grab some things before we go. Susan grabs Caroline's arm and pulls her close, speaking under hushed breath. Don't forget the steps. You will do just fine. Don't think, just do. Hey buddy, filming a documentary? It's time to start getting ready for bed. Big guy, don't make your grandma do everything while we're gone. Video ends 10/21/2023, 6:51 p.m. Video resumes. The camera is facing Corey. The background is dark with no identifiable location. Alright guys, I am sneaking out. I am going to scare the crap out of Mom and Dad. They won't even know what hit them. Grandma never watches me if I'm upstairs. I already snuck back down and am almost to the car. Mom and Dad didn't even see me. This is gonna be so awathom. Video ends 10/21/2023, 6:58 p.m. Video resumes. The camera is facing forward from the rear of the Phillips family SUV. Caroline and Ken quickly enter the car in what seems to be a hurry. The car swiftly starts and begins to roll down the road. Han, I told you we were going to be late. We needed to leave 15 minutes ago. Ken, it's okay. My mom said these types of ceremonies always start late. We won't miss the initiation. My family's connection to the church simply wouldn't allow it. I know. After what happened with Sean. I told you not to bring him up. I know. I'm sorry. I am just nervous. That's all. Plus, I feel naked without my phone. I know this is all secretive and whatnot, but I am just not used to having it. I also worry about your mom with Corey. She never seems to actually watch him. I know, sweetie, but Corey will be just fine. My mom will take good care of him. She knows how big this night is for us and our family. She might be an old crockety bitch now, but she takes care of her own. A light giggle is barely picked up from behind the camera. Video ends 10/21/2023, 7:24 p.m. Video resumes. The car headlights shine down a gravel road barred on each side by large pine trees. They are approaching an iron-stylized gate with hooded figures standing on either side. The figures' dark brown cloaks cover every inch of their bodies, and excess cloth lay on the gravel. As they get closer to the gate, horned masks with long snouts can be seen poking out from under the hoods. One figure raises a hand and the car comes to a stop. The other figure begins to walk toward the driver's side of the car. Ken rolls down the window. Ken. Hi. We are the Phillips family. We were told to be here by 7:30. I know we are cutting it. Cloaked figure. Family origin name, please? Oh, right. It's Walker. The man in the horned mask turns toward the other cloaked figure and nods. Reaching off to something out of frame, the gate starts to swing open. Furfurs. The window is rolled up. Ken nervously looks over to Caroline. She reaches and puts her hand on his thigh. Video ends 10/21/2023, 7:38 p.m. Video resumes. The video is dark, barely discernible. Although faint, it seems to be pointed at Corey's face. Corey can be heard whispering. My parents left. I was too scared to say anything, and I am still in the car. This isn't dinner. Where is this place? The camera pans out the back seat window. Lit torches lead up a dirt pathway toward a large wooden building. The outside details seem to look like an abandoned church, but with no identifiable religious symbols. My parents are in that house, though. I'm going to just wait till they're back. Video ends 10/21/2023 to 9:45 p.m. Video resumes. The camera is facing toward the church. In addition to the torches, it appears a large fire has been lit behind the building. Although the fire is not visible, the light from the flames illuminates the large pine trees. Shadows can be seen cast through the illumination of the fire. In addition to this, there seems to be a barely audible chant that is coming from outside of the car. OpenText AI spits out an error when prompted to discern. I don't know where my parents are at, and I want to go home. I need to find them so we can leave this scary place. I can't see good, but the camera can see good in the dark. Corey sticks his thumb into his mouth as the camera flips around. He opens the back door and climbs from the car down to the ground. He turns toward the lit path and starts to make his way toward it. The chant is now very clear once outside the car. Chant, come now furfurs, come up furfurs, heed thy words. Furfurs, come now furfurs, come up furfurs, heed thy words, furfurs. Corey reaches the path and walks up to the church. He reaches a large wooden door with a cast iron knob. With his offhand not holding the camera, he twists the doorknob and the door swings open. Bright light floods the camera view, and the camera must quickly adjust its focus to its new surroundings. Now in focus, a large empty room lies before Corey. No furniture can be seen, but thousands of red candles are lit on the floor of the church, casting a low-level light that had disoriented the camera. The candles seem to have been lit for a while, as they are melting and pooling out on the large open floor in all directions. As Corey steps through the door frame, the door shuts behind him as the chants grow quieter. The low light of the candles only reaches about 7 to 8 feet above the floorboards, leaving anything above that to the high ceiling of the church shrouded in darkness. A low whisper can be heard, but is not discernible through an ASE headset. OpenText AI provides dialogue when prompted to. Unknown voice. Dad and Mom? Yes, Corey, it's Dad. Come closer. Dad, I am scared. I can't see you. Unknown entity. Don't be scared, follow the sound of my voice. Corey aims the camera down, and his light-up sketcher can be seen walking through the clear patches between candles. Even with caution, Corey's light-up shoes begin to accumulate wax clumps, dampening the effects of the flashing light on the shoes. As he moves forward, the gaps between candles and their pools grow farther apart, and eventually the wood flooring is clear of red wax. The camera pans in a circle. Corey is now in the center of the large room. A small circle clearing of floorboards is where he now stands. Unknown voice. Cool. Furfurs beckons you. The camera pans up into the ceiling rafters. Although hard to tell in the darkness, a large dim silhouette can be seen moving from rafter to rafter above Corey. The whisper seems to be coming from this shadow in the darkness. The chanting from outside the church is now growing to a loud chorus. Either the chanters are moving closer to the church, or more people are joining. Unknown entity. You shall be Minnie, Kuri. What? Dad, what are you doing up there? Come down. We need to go. We need to go. Your dad's soul is Minnie, Corey, and yours is next. You're not my dad. Where is my dad? Dad. Corey cries out into a sob. A loud bang is heard off camera. The chanting now stopped. The camera swivels to a now open door across the room from the door that Corey had walked through. A hooded figure in a horned mask and another man in dress clothes wearing a similar mask stand in the door frame. The man in dress clothes takes his mask off. It is Ken Phillips. Corey, what are you doing here? You can't be here. Ken begins walking toward Corey. The hooded figure next to Ken reaches out to grab Ken's shoulder but misses. Hooded figure, leave him. Do not enter the church. Ken does not falter and continues to step forward into the large room. The hooded figure then backsteps out of the doorframe. Ken does not seem to notice and is focused on Corey. Ken, that's my son. He can't be here. Let me get him. It will take 1 second. Ken is about halfway toward Corey when he freezes mid-stride. From this distance, you can tell that not only his movement had frozen mid-stride, but his facial gestures seem to be fixed in place. Only a small twitch in his brow can be seen. A low-pitched, gravelly voice can now be heard shouting from somewhere in the church. Unknown entity. Murifi, you dare step into the domain of furfures? You have willingly given your soul, but for this act, I will now take your life. Still frozen, Ken instantaneously combusts and is set ablaze. Corey can be heard hyperventilating behind the camera. The shadow that had been above Corey now looms above Ken. A silent scream can be heard escaping from Ken as he burns. Unknown entity silence. Ken's body explodes from seemingly nothing, scattering blood everywhere around the room. A loud moan from the unknown entity can now be heard. The camera now rises into the air and is being rushed back from the scene. The camera falls and is dangling from the strap around Corey's neck. The camera still points back toward where Ken had been. Multiple cloaked figures now stand in the doorframe, and more can be seen standing behind them. The voice of Caroline can be heard through Corey's quick breathing. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Unknown entity. The time of the culling is upon us. Those who have willingly given their souls now must pay penance. Enter my domain, for you hath been chosen. Intrine infernum. Deep laughter booms loudly in the room. The cloaked figures now shuffle into the wax-filled room, walking toward where Ken had once been. A door can be heard opening. Corey and Caroline push through the door frame Corey had entered through and are on the lit dirt path. Loud chanting can now be heard as before, but chanting is something different. Chanting, furfures, intrar in infernum, furfures, intrar in infernum. The sound of a car door opening can be heard, and Corey with the camera is placed into the car. The camera's video is pitch black as it records a seat cushion. A car door can be heard closing, then another opening with another quick close. A frantic shuffling can be heard. Fuck. Where are the goddamn keys? Mom, what happened to Daddy? To Dad? He's okay. Silence fills the car for about 5 seconds. He had the keys. Corey, we're gonna go for a walk. Okay, honey? Mom, I want Daddy. No fussing. A car door opens and closes. Another opens closer to the camera. Corey with the camera lifted into the air again. The camera is now facing the church once again, dangling on the unseen strap. Light emanates from the large fire behind the church, the lit path, and between the boards of the church building itself. A large fire can be seen growing from inside the church. Caroline and Corey start quickly moving away from the car and the scene behind them. The chanting can now again be heard, although faint. Burning figures begin exiting the burning church and shuffle down the lit dirt path. As each burning figure reaches the last torch at the end of the path, their last step past the torch is adjoined with a shallow pop. Following the shallow pop, the cloak of each burning figure blasts up into the air and falls to the ground, now empty. Multiple burning robes now fill the darkness beyond the dirt path. A continuous roaring can be heard reaching over the monotonous chanting from the remaining burning figures. The camera suddenly jerks and swings back and forth. Caroline and Corey have stopped. Mom? What are you doing here? Tonight is the night, sweetie. We are being freed. The promise of immortality is being fulfilled. Where is Ken, dear? Mom, they killed Ken. They lied. I don't know what is in that church, but there is a monster, and he killed Ken. By the wonder of furfores, dear, he was freed. You and Corey must join him in eternal service. Mom, no. They are lying to you. What are you doing? Let go. The last remaining burning figure has hit the end of the lit path, and the cloak explodes into the air. The chanting along with the roaring has stopped. The church is now fully burning. The flames reach 50 feet into the night sky. Caroline drops Corey to the ground as the sound of a struggle between Caroline and Susan can be heard off camera. Two large, dark-clawed hands stretch from the front door of the burning church, grabbing the doorframe on either side. Horns begin to emerge from the fire, spitting out the doorframe. The face of what seems to be an animal or human-animal hybrid looks out. As the horned entity pulls its long, furry body out of the burning church, large wings sprawl out from its back. Now fully out of the burning church, the horns and half-human face most resemble that of an elk, or that of an elk that is dying or deformed. The entity begins to flap up, then down, and gallop in the direction of the trio. As it reaches the end of the path, the large now silhouette glides through the night directly toward the camera. The silhouette closes the distance fast, and the camera with Corey begins lifting into the air. The struggling mother and daughter look up and shrink away from the camera. Caroline reaches into the air toward the camera. As the distance widens, the expression of horror on her face. Susan gleams up brightly toward the camera. Caroline. Corey, no! Caroline and Susan now blend into the expanding darkness. The fire from the burning church dwindled farther and farther away. Loud flaps from the unknown entity can be heard as a roar echoes into the night. Corey can be heard sobbing. The roaring is replaced by booming laughter as the camera strap fails. The silhouette of Corey can briefly be seen, thumb shoved into his mouth, dangling from the long legs of the unknown entity as its claws clutch his shoulders. Wind is now whistling into the camera microphone, and the footage is pitch black. A sharp crack in the audio marks the end of the video. Video ends 10/21/2023, 10:32 p.m. End. As the shadows grow longer, so does the terror. Here's what's next. We went too deep. One of the weirder things I fantasize about is handling the deaths of people I care about. Like, when one of my aunts was very ill, I imagined the extremely moving eulogy I could deliver. I would talk about the meaning she had in our lives, what made her special and unique, and everyone would cry and laugh. In a way, I hate that I do this because I don't want these people to die. But there's a chance they will. I guess I want to be prepared so I can help others handle the deaths too. I can be that comfort for everyone in those times, and I feel a little pride in that. When I got with my girlfriend Tracy, I imagined being a support to her when her grandfather passed away. She was close to him. Without a father in her life, he had brought that stability. He was now in his 80s, having a lot of trouble with his heart, and every day there was a sense of, today could be the day. I didn't want anything to happen to him. I hoped he'd live another decade, if possible. Yet, I thought a lot about the ways in which I could be there to get her through it when he did. It's kind of a hero fantasy. It's also kind of a planning fantasy, like when you imagine how you'd escape a building if a crazed shooter showed up. You imagine the places you'd hide, exits you'd take, or you think about how you'd sneak and conceal your identity to steal something you want to steal from a store or home. All of my fantasizing put me in a good place to jump into action when we got the news that Grandpa Terry was on his deathbed. It was a matter of days. He was coming in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, he was talking and seemed in good spirits, they said. I barely knew Grandpa Terry. He'd been sick for years before I got with Tracy. She introduced me to him when we drove upstate once. He was a nice man. He still smoked cigars. He used to work in the jukebox business. Before he met Tracy's grandmother, he used to live with 2 women. He also claimed he got in a fist fight with Harry Belafonte. So Grandpa Terry was cool from what I saw. But I must have been just background noise to him, some guy dating his granddaughter for 3 months. When we got to the hospital, the 5th floor, where they put folks who are expected to die, we found Tracy's entire family had gathered. Some I'd met, and some had come from all over the country to give their farewell. Bringing in coffee pots and donuts to stay as long as they needed to stay, they'd practically taken over the sitting room on the floor. Tracy asked her mother what was going on. They were speaking in whispers, but I overheard bits, enough to get the idea. He had spoken to everyone as a group, and now just wanted some peace. He had had the nurse bring his brother in for a one-on-one chat, and his oldest daughter. That was it. Everyone had to wait outside ever since. I was stroking Tracy's hair and letting her talk about her feelings when the nurse stepped out again. As she walked down the hallway, every family member's head raised or swiveled to her, as if wondering if they would be the chosen one to receive Grandpa Terry's last words. She walked past them all to me and Tracy. I tapped Tracy gently and smiled at her. But the nurse looked at me and said, "He wants to talk to you." I explained to her that I wasn't family, and she had me mixed up with someone else. Tracy was readily agreeing with me and looking around for who I could possibly have been mistaken for. "You're Douglas?" the nurse asked. When she saw me nod, she added, "Come along." I followed her, sure that she was making a mistake, and I would have to come awkwardly walking back out in a few seconds. I saw the family members staring at me with incredulity and maybe resentment. If it wasn't a mistake, then I assumed I would be getting threatened with haunting if I didn't treat Tracy right. The nurse opened the door slightly, enough to allow me to squeeze in, then entered behind me, shutting the door. Inside, Grandpa Terry was propped up in bed, wearing a fancy red smoking jacket. He had a strange look about him. His skin seemed stiff and his eyes an empty black. He was like a wax figure of himself, or ventriloquist's dummy. His feet stuck straight up in their hard-soled slippers. Other than his eyes and his mouth, his body didn't move. It was just dressed and propped there. "Douglas," he said in clear but weakened voice, "have a seat." Well, now I knew it was me he wanted, at least. "Douglas, I've been wanting to talk to you about your ASMR videos." Of all the things he could have said to me at that moment, that wasn't even on the radar. For one, I don't talk about my ASMR videos. I didn't want anybody knowing. I hadn't even told Tracy or my friends. So how did he know about them? 2. How did this old man who still had a landline phone and used a typewriter to send letters know about ASMR videos at all? "Yes, sir," was what I managed to say. "They make me feel strange things, Douglas." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your ASMR videos make me feel strange things, Douglas. Things I'm not supposed to feel. I'm scared of these strange things I'm feeling watching your videos, Douglas." I looked over to the nurse to see if she would intervene or explain. The nurse stood impassively in the corner of the room with a towel over one arm. She resembled more a bathroom attendant. Her presence unnerved me further. "Yes, I talked to the nurse about ASMR, and she has told me that I am supposed to feel a pleasant tingling sensation that starts at my scalp. When I watch your ASMR videos, I don't feel a pleasant tingling sensation that starts at my scalp. When I watch your ASMR videos, I feel strange things I can't explain or describe. Like that feeling when you say a word so many times it doesn't sound like the right word anymore, but about everything. Worse and stranger. These are strange things, Douglas. Strange things to feel. They make me afraid." "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm not supposed to feel these strange things watching your videos, Douglas. I'm not supposed to feel these strange things ever, I don't think. I'm not supposed to have these feelings. Your ASMR videos make me remember things I haven't remembered since I was a little boy. It has been so long since I remembered these things. I only know they're memories because it's all so familiar. If they aren't memories, how can it feel like I've been there? If they aren't memories, how are these places in my head? These places and things I remember give me those strange feelings, Douglas." The nurse still stood with the towel, saying nothing. I didn't like the things Grandpa was saying, and I didn't like that I had no support in this room from the only professional. "I don't think I can help you, sir," I answered. "Maybe just watch someone else's videos." "No, you did something in those videos to make me feel strange things." "Why? What did you do?" I stood up to leave. I felt at this point I should get the family involved. I was only agitating a poor dying man. This man had fist-fought Harry Belafonte. He shouldn't be arguing with me about ASMR videos. "I need to go further in," he said. "Your videos take me part of the way, to where I'm slipping between a bit awake and a bit asleep. That's when these memories and strange feelings come down. It's sudden, like my head nodding as I'm falling asleep. Just like when my head nods, it makes me snap back out. I lose it. It's just a hazy impression. I need to go further in, Douglas. I don't have much longer. If I die now, if I die without going in, I need you to do your ASMR to help me." There was a knock on the door. I heard Tracy asking, "Is everything okay in there?" The nurse sprang like a bear trap, darting across the 12 feet or so to the door and announced, "Everything is fine, ma'am. Please don't disturb the patient any further." I heard a stifled sob, I think, but there were no further disturbances. The nurse remained at the door, effectively blocking me if I tried to escape. "I can show you my other videos, sure, but wouldn't you rather spend your last moments with your family? They're out there." "I know, Douglas, I know," he said in an agonized voice, "but I can't do that until I understand." I pulled out my phone and was getting YouTube up when he said, "Come over here and pretend you're applying makeup on me. There's a makeup kit in the drawer there. The nurse got it." I walked over to the stand he was pointing out. In the drawer, I found a compact with some different eyeshadow colors, foundation in a few skin tones, blush and bronze, 2 different sizes of brush, some eyebrow pencils, mascara and lipstick in the shade Pina Colada. "Take me further in, Douglas," Grandpa Terry said. I felt really weird about this. I felt trapped, because it seemed like this was a man's dying wish, but it's like he had this planned. How did he know I would even be here? Tracy asked me at the last minute. She said she had intended to go with her sister. How long had he been waiting for this? Plus, he was an old man who had done manly stuff all his life. I didn't want to pretend to apply makeup on him. It was weird. Maybe I should just do a fake eye exam, or just bring that stuff over here, set it on my belly and start, he said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I did as he asked, loading up the items and setting them gently on the old man's smoking jacket. I looked over to the nurse at the door to see if she was watching me. She was still facing the door. The old man looked up at me expectantly. It was like someone asking you to sing in front of them when you just don't do that. "Let me see what we got here first," I said. This was something I like to do in my videos. Take my time, handle objects, examine them. Some folks get the tingles from that. Grandpa nodded. "Got some nice colors in here," I said to myself about the eyeshadow set. I started reading off some of the color names. On I went, examining each item, reading off ingredients, muttering this and that. Then I told him I would start with applying a foundation layer. I think he'd entered some kind of trance. He seemed to be looking through me. I'm in a strange town, an older part of town, wrong side of the "don't stop, please." I was so shocked to hear him start speaking, I had stopped what I was doing to listen. I went back to pretending to apply foundation to Grandpa Terry and explaining how important it is to get a nice, even coat. I don't know if that's true. With ASMR, reality doesn't matter. Let me ramble, I'll ramble and you roleplay. Yes, I know this place, where the concrete is crumbling under an abandoned overpass and along the old off-ramp, a little shop. What is this shop? It's so late. Why is it still open? Who comes to this place? The images of the place he described rose vividly into my mind, like long-forgotten memories. Vivid yet strange, disconnected from the vast body of memories that form my regular biography. I must have seen this place somewhere before. It felt so familiar. What was this place he was describing? I didn't like this. I was getting nervous. But I got out the eyebrow pencil and kept making motions in front of the entranced face. The inside has a nice wood flooring. Unusual flooring for this place. Merchandise placed tidily on shelves. What are they selling? What is this? Merchandise. There are a few customers inside looking at the merchandise. A woman is behind the counter. Nobody notices me. They aren't right. Is this a memory? I feel like I can move on my own. There's a dark corner with something valuable. I should go to it. Make me go further, Douglas. I laid it on thick, making swish sounds with my mouth as I swiped with the eyebrow pencil and murmuring to myself. I leaned in closer to his ear and said something about eyebrows. "Douglas?" he shouted, his voice tinged with chilling levels of alarm. "They see me now. Oh no, I can't go. I mustn't move. Oh God, they're all looking at me." I tried to tell him he's fine and safe, but he continued. "What is this place? They say I shouldn't be here. Douglas, they heard you too. They can see you. How? Douglas, stop moving. Stop for the love of God." I stopped instantly. I felt a cold shiver, nothing like ASMR, run through me. My foreboding had culminated dread. What Grandpa described felt real. I can't explain it, but I could almost see it. They're coming, they're coming, they're coming, he blurted in panic. Douglas, help me get out of here. I can't get out. Help, they're mad at us. More makeup. I looked to the nurse, hoping she would inject him with a sedative. He clawed the air for my help. I hastily pretended to apply lipstick to him, making little pop sounds with my mouth and feeling stupid the whole time. I'm at a high rise now, Grandpa Terry said, much calmer now. It's being converted to apartments. There's a crane machine far away. Nobody's here. It's brown. I take an elevator up to a high-up floor, but not the top. It's the 35th floor, isn't it? I asked on impulse. I remembered this place too. I don't remember remembering it before just then, but I was sure I'd seen it. I feel strange, Grandpa Terry said. Me too, I said. We should stop. No, please, I need to go further in, please. With a sigh, I started swishing eyeshadow. There's no way we could both have vague, distant memories of these very particular places. I'd had dreams of this place, glimpses somehow. I felt like we were messing with something we shouldn't be. Yet I continued. This floor is unfinished. I enter one of the apartments, 26, to look around. Windows haven't been installed. Plastic sheeting blows inward. It's so dark in here. It's a long apartment. One long hallway with a few little rooms. Modern. Down that one way there's the bathroom, I think. I need to use the bathroom. This room's closed. The door is closed. I felt a wave of dread that made my limbs weak. I fumbled the eyeshadow, dropping it on Grandpa Terry, making a dusty mess on his smoking jacket. I expected him to yell at me, but he didn't seem to notice. I grabbed the mascara and made some swishes. Someone's on the other side of this door, he said. Grandpa made a long ee sound that chilled my blood. Someone's in there, he half squealed, half whispered. I'm sure of it. I feel someone on the other side of the door waiting. They've been waiting. It wants to harm me. It wants us to open the door, to harm us. It knows we're here. They know what I'm saying and what we're thinking. The person on the other side of the door knows things. It wants to hurt us real bad. I had started shaking Grandpa Terry to snap him out of it. I hoped he was crazy, but I was trembling and deeply disturbed by what he was saying. This place was real. We shouldn't be doing this, Douglas. I was wrong. We're in danger. I'm not doing this anymore, I shouted. No more ASMR, snap out of it. I didn't even care if his family heard and came running. I just wanted him to knock it off. Nobody did come running, though. Even the nurse just kept her post at the door. I'll walk away and maybe it'll stay there in that closed room. Just stay there forever waiting. Maybe it can't open the door. Maybe they'll just stand there for all time, just like before. No, they won't wait much longer. I need to go. Come on, drop it, old man. You're freaking me out, I shouted. It knows. It knows we're right here. It won't let me just go. It's gonna come out. It's something from outside. Help me get out, Douglas. More ASMR. Cranial nerve exam. Quick. Quick. This is insane, I said. I won't. Grandpa Terry's eyes opened wide and he started to scream. Blood formed in the corner of his eyes. I looked to the nurse and demanded she help him. She handed me a stethoscope and a pen. I was desperate, and maybe she knew something. I don't know. Medical benefits of ASMR. I did it. I started moving the pen around in the air, asking him to follow it with his eyes. Oh, thank God, he sighed, and I could feel it too. We had transitioned somewhere else. I'm not sure how I knew, but I knew. We're in a department store, he said. After hours, so dark in here. I haven't been here since I was a kid, but it's different now. Deeper. How to get deeper. There are still people here shopping. Oh no. They're all here. Have to keep going. I moved my fingers in and out of his view frame, pretending he was telling me stop when he saw my fingers and telling him good. I struggled to do this while my hands shook and I felt sick inside. I knew this place. I'd seen it. I'd been there as a kid too, and I dreamed of it. It had gotten deeper. It was a bad place. He had to get outside quick. I'm going to go outside, have to get outside. It's at the far end, the deepest. Good, I said. Good. Now sharp or dull? I found the doors, he announced after minutes of quiet panic. I'm going out into the parking lot, so dark. A few cars in the dark, and streetlights. Nothing beyond. Dark everywhere. Some grasses and a gas station far, far away. Not really there. We made a mistake, Douglas. They're out. They're coming out. They know they see you looking at you through me, those cold, empty eyes. These weren't memories. I threw the stethoscope against the wall. I began making as many loud, obnoxious noises as I could, hitting the metal frame of the bed, coughing, anti-ASMR sounds. I heard the door open. I expected the family to come charging in, wondering what I was doing to the family patriarch. In fact, the sound was just the nurse leaving. She gingerly shut the door behind her. When I turned back, Grandpa Terry was dead. His eyes were frozen in terror. Trickles of blood ran from the corners and from his ears. I backed to the door and left the room. I had to go tell this family now that Grandpa Terry died while I, practically a stranger, spent his last moments. But I didn't have to. Nobody was there. His family had just left. It was inexplicable. Where had they gone? Where was the nurse? I checked the sitting room. Nobody was there, just the boxes of donuts and tanks of coffee. I asked at the desk, and nobody knew what I was talking about. All they cared about was one of their patients was now dead. I texted Tracy to let her know her beloved grandfather had just passed while she wandered off. She never answered. She never returned my calls. Ever. She disappeared from my life, from everything, social media, all of it. She was just gone. I never saw or heard from her or her family again. I couldn't understand it. I stopped making ASMR videos after that. I haven't stopped watching them, though. Sometimes I dream of these places still, places like the ones Grandpa Terry described. But it's okay. He was right. The videos aren't enough to get deep. I keep feeling like maybe someday I'll see the old man in there, and sometimes I think I feel him just around the corner, but deeper. And I feel a warning that we went too deep. If you think you can't take any more, this next story might change your mind. April 4th, 2021. The wind howled through the ancient trees, a biting chill wrapping around me as I ventured deeper into Denali National Park. I had been working as a park ranger for nearly 5 years, and with each passing season, my fascination with Alaskan legends grew. The tales of spirits and ancient rituals told by the locals intrigued me, and today I was determined to uncover some of the park's secrets for myself. The grove I entered was unlike any other I had seen. Towering pines with gnarled branches stood like sentinels, their dark silhouettes contrasting against the dim sky. I paused, taking a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air, feeling a thrill of excitement. In my years here, I had heard whispers of an ancient site, a place where rituals were performed to appease the spirits of the land. It was said to be hidden away, deep in the woods, and I was finally on its trail. As I pushed past a thicket, I stumbled upon the clearing. My heart raced. Scattered across the ground were feathers of all shapes and sizes, glinting in the dim light, and strange bone talismans that hung from the branches like forgotten trophies. They looked weathered, ancient, and yet somehow fresh, as if they had been placed there only yesterday. I knelt down to inspect them closer, my hands brushing against the cool earth. The air felt thick here, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. I began to take notes in my journal, scribbling down descriptions and sketches of the artifacts. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound journal half buried beneath a pile of leaves. Curious, I pulled it out, brushing the dirt off its cover. The journal was filled with hurried handwriting, scrawled in black ink. The last entry sent shivers down my spine. The cold one is watching. I hear it whispering my name, feel its icy hands dragging me down into the earth. I must leave this place. If you find this, do not linger in the grove after dark. The words echoed in my mind. I closed the journal, a chill creeping up my spine. I was alone in the woods, and the shadows were growing longer. Ignoring the growing unease in my stomach, I decided to return to my cabin before nightfall. As I retraced my steps, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, almost like a warning. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding with each footfall. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper like the rustling of leaves. It seemed to echo around me, repeating my name, Amelia. I froze, glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the trees, the shadows, and the relentless wind. I shook my head, dismissing it as the wind playing tricks. I continued on, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Amelia, come closer. My skin prickled with dread. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground was pulling me back. I looked down, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch, writhing and pulsating, beckoning me to come closer. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. It felt like icy fingers were wrapping around my arms, pulling me down into the earth. Panic surged through me. I could almost hear laughter mingling with the whispers, and I stumbled backward, desperately trying to break free. I remembered the journal's warning and fought against the unseen force dragging me down. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. I couldn't let it take me. I dug my heels into the frozen ground and pulled with all my might. Just as the pressure became unbearable, I felt a sudden release. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, breathless and wide-eyed. The grove fell silent. I lay there, gasping for air, the world spinning around me. It took a moment before I could gather my thoughts. I crawled to my feet, still shivering, and glanced around, half expecting to see the specter of the Cold One hovering nearby. Instead, there was nothing but the whispering wind and the shadows dancing between the trees. But as I turned to leave, a voice echoed through the grove, soft yet menacing, "Amelia." It sent a wave of ice through my veins. I didn't look back as I ran, not daring to slow down until I reached the safety of my cabin. That night, I locked every door and window, but the whispers lingered, haunting my thoughts. Every rustle outside felt like a reminder that the Cold One was out there, waiting. I didn't sleep, staring into the darkness, my heart racing at every noise. Even now, I can still hear that voice, faint but clear, echoing through the trees. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but the chill in the air tells me otherwise. The legends were true, and I had come too close to something that was never meant to be disturbed. So if you ever find yourself wandering through Denali's ancient groves, heed my warning. Don't linger after dark, and whatever you do, don't listen for your name. The Cold One might just answer. Hold on tight, because the horrors are just beginning. Listen closely to what comes next. I found out the secret of the weirdest man in my hometown. It was worse than I could have imagined. He turned up around 6 months ago. It was us students who noticed him first, since every day he'd walk past the town's high school at around the same time. The kids would be out in the yard, playing basketball and gossiping, would stop what they were doing to watch Hum stroll by. He never looked at us, but by God did we make a game out of looking at him. What got everyone was how he dressed. He didn't show a speck of skin. His entire body was covered with some piece of clothing. It looked like a kid who'd gotten into their parents' closet. Everything he wore was mismatched and tattered. Usually it'd be a long brown duster coat, tartan slacks, and a horribly stained shirt. Occasionally he'd throw in a scarf or a hat, or maybe a second coat under the duster. He wore gloves, sometimes leather, sometimes silk, and a tweed mask. His mask was hard to explain. It wrapped around his head perfectly, with no visible seams or eye holes. We didn't know whether he could see or not, but he never had any trouble walking or crossing the road. I think it's the mask that really got people's imagination wearing. Some of the kids guessed he might have a rare skin disease. Others thought that he might have been a worker at the old chemical plant and was badly burned when the factory burnt down. But that would have made him at least 90 years old. A bunch of older kids spread the rumor that he was some sick serial killer, laying low in our sleepy town, covering his face in case someone recognizes him from a wanted poster or breaking news bulletin. Everyone liked to propound from the sidelines, but no one had the guts to actually find out. Not until tonight. It was the 26th of October. School had just ended for a week-long break, and I was going to my first real party. I barely knew the guy whose house it was at, but I leapt at the chance of underage drinking. The night turned out great. We all had fun, and managed to not throw up once. I downed a whole packet of apple-flavored chewing gum to try and mask the smell of alcohol on my breath for my parents, although I had a feeling they'd be able to tell anyway. Me and 3 close friends left the party just before 11 and set off staggering home. We passed my friend Luke's house first. As he walked up to his front door, a light came on, and his mother stepped out, her face contorted with pure anger. We laughed at Luke and stumbled on our way as he realized he mixed up the dates and forgot to tell his parents he was going out tonight. Me, Shane, and Rowan kept messing around as we navigated our way back home. Shane's house was next, and since I lived so far out, I was planning on having a sleepover at Rowan's. We turned a corner, still laughing from a joke we made a block ago, and saw someone. All three of us crouched behind the fence, peeping out from behind to confirm our suspicions. Walking down the middle of the road was the masked man. He was in his usual getup, only he'd taken off his gloves. We all squinted to try and get a better look. The only light we had came from a pathetic, constantly buzzing street lamp, but we were desperate to finally see what he's been hiding. All of a sudden, he turned and began walking up to a house. He stepped up onto the porch and opened the door. Just as he walked inside, we could see him slowly take off his mask, and then the door slammed shut behind him. The three of us looked at each other, all thinking the same thing. The mystery of what the masked man looked like was still that. A mystery. He had his back to us, and even in perfect daylight, we wouldn't have been able to make his face out. The first one of us to commit our thoughts to speech was Shane. He told us, pumping out his chest, that he was going to go see which of the rumors was true. He said he had a plan, and before me or Rowan could say anything, Shane was already halfway across the street. We looked at each other and followed him, coming up to the masked man's old house. It was noticeably more run down than the other houses on the block. The paint was peeling, the gutter had almost fallen down, and an upstairs window had been shattered. The three of us stood around the front door, keeping our voices low, as Shane explained his grand plan. He said he was going to simply knock on the front door. When the masked man answered, he'd say, "Oh, sorry, wrong house," and then just turn around and leave, but not before getting a good eyeful of him. We all thought that it was a flawless plan and egged him on as we took our hiding place behind a bush at the end of the masked man's property. As I got a good look at the house, I realized that I recognized it. My dad had this friend who had gone through a rough divorce. He slept in our spare room for a few weeks before he eventually won the house back in the court settlement. Around 6 months ago, he moved out of town without so much as a goodbye. I could remember when I was much younger him showing his car off to me. That thing was his pride and joy. I couldn't believe this was the same house. My thoughts were bisected by the sound of Shane rapping his knuckles on the front door. He turned to look at us and gave us a dumb grin and a thumbs up. I think he was about to crack a joke when the door opened. Standing at the entrance was the masked man. He'd taken off his mask as well as most of his clothes. That much I could make out as he was still shrouded in shadows. There wasn't a single light on in his house, and to me and Rowan, he wasn't anything more than a silhouette. As we both tried to discreetly get a better look, Shane began stuttering out his excuse. Suddenly, he stopped. There was a pause before he began to scream in a shrill pitch. We watched as the masked man grabbed Shane by his lower jaw and violently yanked him inside the house, the door slamming shut behind him. Me and Rowan looked on in shock. I turned to Rowan to ask him what we should do, but before I could speak, he was up and running to the front door. He started pounding on it and yelling expletives. I ran up behind him and yanked him away. I held him and asked if he was crazy. As he began mumbling a response, the front door began to open. We both bolted like a greyhound out of a trap and dived behind the corner of the house. We stayed there, holding our breath and waiting to meet the same fate as Shane. Eventually, Rowan found enough courage to peep around the edge of the wall. He didn't see anyone. He moved out a little further and saw that the door was still closed. I pulled him back and told him that we should call the police. He snorted and explained to me that they'd probably arrest us for underage drinking. We'd spend the night in some jail cell, and by the time we could explain ourselves, Shane would be dead. Before I could question his reasoning, Rowan walked over to a window, cupped his hands and peeked in. I sighed, frustrated, and asked if he saw anything. He was replying with a long, drawn-out no, when suddenly he yelped and crouched down. Seeing his reaction, I instinctively did the same. I crawled over to him, and in a voice just below a whisper, I asked him what he'd seen. I could see the fear in his eyes as he told me that saw the masked man, now mostly derobed, walking out from what he guessed was a door to the basement. After that, Rowan started muttering to himself about how the masked man must have seen him. I knew that Shane, my best friend for as long as I could remember, was in the basement. My stomach churned thinking about what I had to do next. I held my breath as I stood and peered in through the window. I couldn't see the masked man anywhere. I nudged the window and my suspicions were confirmed. Like the front door, the window was left unlocked and slightly ajar. I tried to steady my breath as I pulled the window all the way open. Rowan looked at me in shock as I asked him to give me a leg up. Still, he complied. Once I was inside, I pulled him in after me. Before I did, he grabbed a fist-sized rock from the garden. "For self-defense," he told me. The house was perfectly still. Every surface was covered in a thin veneer of dust. We both stood there for a second, trying to hear the masked man. There wasn't a sound, other than the faint dripping of some faraway faucet. In what we thought was relative safety, we crept our way to the door the masked man had emerged from. I gently opened it, and sure enough, I was met with a staircase descending into the impenetrable darkness of the basement. I didn't dare call out Shane's name in fear that he wouldn't be the only one who'd hear me. Instead, I began my way down the stairs, Rowan following right behind me. My mother had given me a small wind-up torch, so I could make my way home safely at night, she said. I fished around in my coat pocket for it, my hand clutching the familiar metal. Just as I reached the bottom, I found the button and switched it on, finally illuminating the room. It took me a while to realize what I was seeing, but judging from Rowan's deafening scream, he knew right away. Shane was hanging upside down from the ceiling, a chained hook driven through both of his ankles. He had long, fresh cuts across his throat, wrists, and legs, which were all pouring with blood. The blood dripped down into a series of angled metal sheeting, which directed the flow into a steel trough. There were 4 other bodies hanging from chains, all serving the same purpose. Some looked like they'd been there for weeks. We both turned and ran. As we scrambled back up the stairs, my torch beam fell on the figure standing motionless in the doorway. We slowly stepped back down the stairs until we were at the bottom again. We froze, watching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the figure began to lift slowly off the ground. In an instant, it shot down the stairs, flying through the air like it had been thrown. I dived out of the way, but Rowan wasn't as lucky. The thing piled into him and pinned him to the ground. As I got to my feet, I saw it run its black, claw-like fingernails across his neck. I screamed, and the masked man turned to look at me. It lifted itself to its feet and lunged. I grabbed the rusted hook dangling from the chain above me and swung it. It plowed into the front of the thing's head, caving it in. It went limp. The momentum from swinging the hook almost made me fall backwards into the trough of blood. I steadied my footing and dropped down next to Rowan. He laid motionless. There was a gaping wound along the side of his neck, and he didn't so much as gurgle. I knew there was nothing I could do. With tears streaking down my cheeks, I turned and began to somberly make my way up the flight of stairs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned to look, and saw the masked man yank the rusted claw out of its head and stand. It straightened itself and turned to meet my gaze. I ran frantically up the remaining steps. I could hear the thing let out an animalistic screech as it flew through the air behind me. I burst out of the basement and into the living room, making a clear dash for the front door. The masked man threw itself into me, sending me spiraling. I landed on a glass coffee table, which shattered from the force. I lay in pain on a bed of broken glass as the creature that had killed my friends loomed. It dropped down on top of me and lowered its face agonizingly close to mine. It was now that I finally got a good look at what it looked like under the mask. The thing's face looked like a naked mole rat, bleached white with chemicals. Its eyes were a mess of tumors and scar tissue, filled with a black-purple pus festering in the sockets. The soft tissue of its nose and ears looked partially digested. The gums were black and oozing a mephitic ichor, lined with fragments of tooth bits. Its front 2 cuspids, however, looked perfectly maintained and began protruding even further out. They now looked longer than my index finger and as sharp as razor wire. I shoved a shard of glass deep into the thing's neck. It pierced clean through to the vertebrae, embedding itself. Black, tar-like blood began to ooze, then spurt violently out of the wound. The masked man fell backwards, writhing around on the floor in pain. I staggered to my feet, limping to the front door before breaking into a half sprint. Afraid it would come after me, I ran straight to the next door neighbor, I began pounding in their door until I saw a light come on upstairs. I heard movement in the house and the door opened. Blinking the sleep out of his eyes and wearing a lime green bathrobe was Gary, my Sunday school teacher. He recognized me instantly and brought me into the safety of his home when he saw that I was drenched in blood. He laid a plastic sheet on a couch and told me to sit while he made tea. I sat and tried to catch my breath. I was still reeling from the night's events. Still, I felt safe in Gary's front room. It smelt like my grandma's house. I took out my phone and with a shaking finger tried to ring my mother. The kettle boiled and Gary poured my tea. He walked in from the kitchen, handed me the mug, and sat down next to me. We called the police, and I spent the next few minutes trying to explain to him what happened. Once I had, he seemed to go into shock. He just sat there, bound by my words. Eventually, he snapped out of it and slowly turned to look at me. He told me that I could go clean up in his downstairs bathroom, and I realized the state I must be in. He showed me to the bathroom and left me to wash myself. It felt good to scrub the faded grime from my skin. I tried to avoid looking at myself in the mirror. I was drying my face with a hand towel when I heard a knocking at Gary's front door. I assumed it was either my mother or the police, and evidently, so did Gary. The next thing I heard was his scream, followed by the door being thrown open. His screams were cut short and replaced with the bestial growl coming from what could only be the masked man. I turned to the bathroom door and frantically fumbled with the key, locking it. I dropped to the floor and curled up in a ball under the sink as I began to sob quietly to myself. I heard labored footsteps coming from the hallway. Within seconds, they were just outside the door. A low scratching noise came, followed by a thunderous pounding as the masked man tried desperately to break down the door. Its hinges rattled as wood began to splinter. The midsection buckled and split. I could hear the wailing of sirens as police cars neared as the masked man's hand crept from the hole in the door. It felt around for the lock as pus leaked from the soft flesh and exposed nerve surrounding its black-purple fingernails. I could hear vehicles pulling up outside as I watched it hook its talons around the key. It ripped it, and the rest of the door handle, from the wood, sending splinters flying around the room. A group of police officers made their way through the front door. One swore to God when he saw what was left of Gary. The bathroom door fell to the side. The masked man stood in the hallway, staring into my soul and priming its teeth, which began protruding even further from its gums. There was a deafening gunfire, and I clasped my hands around my ears, screaming as I watched the masked man get shot maybe half a dozen times. It staggered back then, dropped to all fours as the police opened fire again. It climbed up the wall and began crawling upside down along the ceiling. 3 officers gave chase as one barged his way past the broken bathroom door and took my hand, leading me out of the house. I saw my mother's car parked amongst the police cars. She stood next to it, crying as 2 officers tried to console her. She saw me and ran over, wrapping me in her arms. The police kept me a little while longer to take a witness statement. Eventually, my mother convinced them to let me come home with her. They agreed, took our address, and told us that they'd call around tomorrow morning to talk further. I climbed into the back of my mother's car as she began to drive. She was silent, letting me rest as we neared our home. Soon, the rows of houses were replaced with trees. I watched them go by as I felt myself drifting off to sleep. The last thing I can remember of that night was seeing a white blur, something keeping pace with the car just beyond the tree line. If you thought that last story was chilling, brace yourself for what's coming next. We built a resort on my grandfather's property. We shouldn't have. Before the burnt people took over, my grandfather's homestead was an oasis of calm. The homestead was in the midst of the steppe, but neither forest nor mountains were far. My cousin and I spent most of our childhoods there. It was a good place for young boys to grow up. Our parents worked, the city was rough, and the old man could always use an extra pair of hands. We had free reign over the property, but our grandfather always warned us to not venture into the nearby forest. At night, by the light of the stove, he would tell us stories about a dark place of science which we were to avoid at all costs. He called it the Kalimi Kondurga, though tales of evil and corruption, and the incomprehensible piqued our young interest. Neither me nor my cousin disobeyed our grandfather's instructions. As long as we were obedient, the old man was kind. Neither of us were interested in seeing his anger. Though the prospect of a cursed science facility provoked all sorts of alluring vapors from our imagination, we kept ourselves satiated by playing with the massive turtles we'd find in the grass. After we finished our schooling, my cousin moved out west. He always had a mind for business and thought of himself as the next great global innovator. I, on the other hand, preferred a quieter life. For a couple of years, I worked in the city, doing jobs not worth mention. And then, when the honking of cars and smell of smog got on my nerves, I moved back out into the homestead to help care for the old man. As we grew older and warier of fairy tales, my grandfather shifted his stories from the fantastical to practical warnings about drugs, guns, and affairs with married women. Yet, near the end of his life, confined to his bed with me as his sole caretaker, the old man returned to speaking of the Kalimikwandurba. He pleaded with me as if he could see the future in his fevered dreams, that both me and my cousin and anyone we cared for were to stay away from the forest. He also demanded that we never sell the property, lest it ends up in the hands of forces beyond the reach of man. At the time, I dismissed his words as the ramblings of an unwell mind. The funeral was a small, private affair for a quiet man who lived in solitude. There is much bureaucracy associated with properly burying the dead. It's in the various office waiting rooms that I made peace with my grandfather's passing. The funeral, to me, was but an end to the legal proceedings by then. As distant as the ceremony was to me, however, during the funeral repast, I found a familiar face that brought tears to my eyes. It was my cousin. He had traveled across half the globe to come pay his respects. Though he missed the burial, he stayed for the food. When I found out he had arrived straight from the airport and was yet to arrange his accommodation, I didn't ask. I insisted. My cousin would sleep in the guest house at the homestead. He was, after all, going to be inheriting half of it. My cousin was happy to accompany me out of town. He was curious about how my life had been over the past couple of years. He was also curious about the property. My cousin had made a name for himself out west. Initially, he worked for an import-export company that he quickly rose through the ranks of, and once he had accumulated enough capital, he started to invest. He had made a name for himself in stocks, and he was in the process of making an even bigger name for himself in the realm of cryptocurrency. Even though most of his money was tied up in the clouds. However, my cousin was curious about other investment opportunities. For the first week he stayed with me, my cousin didn't mention anything about developing the land. Occasionally, he would bemoan the lack of Wi-Fi or hot water, but for the most part, he would speak about the inherent tranquility of the homestead. He said people out west would pay good money to get away from the rumble of urban life to a place like this. It's not until a week into staying on the property that my cousin suggested we try setting up a business. I did not like the idea of developing the land at first. Even when my cousin promised to shoulder all of the construction costs, I disliked the idea of strangers spending time at the homestead. I was resistant at first, but the man had a way with words. He also owned half of the property. The construction crew that worked on additional housing was beyond rowdy and tested my patience every step of the way. Yet, when they set up the water boiler in the guest house, they bought my sympathies. Daily hot showers soothed my temper, and soon enough I found myself amicable to the idea of the homestead being turned into a resort. As my cousin would say, we found much peace on the property when we were young. It would be a sin not to make some money off of sharing it. After about a year and a half, the housing my cousin had commissioned was completed. The cottages were humble, and my grandfather's old home was transformed into a relaxing communal area. Though the lodgings were nice, and my cousin offered them for a bargain, we had trouble finding customers. My cousin had accrued a substantial amount of debt and was turning more agitated with every trip he took to the city. Apparently, along with the troubles with our new resort, his cryptocurrency portfolio had turned shaky. He floated the idea of selling the property, but he only did so once. On his following trip to the city, he returned with Fatima. Fatima said she could ensure our resort would be well booked and my cousin's financial woes would be fixed. I have met few people with piercings throughout my life, but if they were to gather all their jewelry in a pile, they wouldn't have even half of the metal Fatima carried on her face. She dressed in garish, bright colors and constantly smoked and didn't inspire the smallest bit of confidence in me. Fatima looked well out of place at our step resort, yet she was well versed in the art of the internet. Though I did not know where to look whenever the two of us spoke, Fatima kept to her promise. Soon enough, the resort was turning a profit. Through social media and a couple of personal favors, Fatima managed to bring our resort to the forefront of people's search result. After but a couple of weeks, we had various influencers from around the world come through our little resort and sing praises to their audiences, who in turn replicated their idol's pilgrimage. I would spend most of my time in my separated cottage, but whenever I walked through the lobby, Fatima would be there. Sometimes she'd be working on her laptop. Sometimes she would be chatting with the guests and recommending hikes and other local attractions. We never spoke much. For months, Fatima remained a stranger to me. Yet one morning, when two unexpected visitors showed up at our humble resort, I found an ally in her. They both wore lab coats and introduced themselves as Dr. Bharat and Professor Willow. Bharat was local, had a messy head of black hair, and seemed to be the less talkative of the two. Willow towered over his colleague and led all the negotiations. Willow, unlike Bharat, was American. When the man realized I couldn't properly understand him, he aimed all of his communication at my cousin and Fatima. My cousin made little effort to translate, but Fatima was kind enough to keep me in the loop. The two men in lab coats, according to Fatima, were representatives of a scientific organization that was looking for housing for their employees. They were interested in buying the property. The offered sum spread a smile across my cousin's face, yet Fatima disagreed with it. Apparently, the place had more potential. I knew little of the financials, but I didn't like Dr. Bharat nor Professor Willow. I told my cousin I thought Fatima was right and that I would not consent to a sale to the two men. When my refusal was translated to Professor Willow, like a child, he stormed out of my cousin's office. Dr. Bharat hung around for a while longer, gently prodding at my cousin with the promise of quick cash. But when it became clear the property would not be sold, he too made his exit. My cousin wasn't pleased with how negotiations had panned out, but Fatima soothed his woes. The resort was, after all, doing well. If he would give her time, she could bring in even more revenue with a couple renovations and investments. My cousin was reluctant, yet eventually, with a fair amount of prodding from me, he acquiesced. When the meeting was over, Fatima walked me to my cottage. "I presume you're familiar with the stories they tell about the nearby woods?" she asked, as she lit up her hand-rolled cigarette. I told her I was. "And I presume you don't believe in them?" I told her I didn't. "Neither do I," she said. "But if I did, I would presume those two have business in that forest. I don't believe in children's fairy tales, but I also wouldn't want to risk getting into bed with anyone from the Cluny Quanderva." It had been years since I heard the name. Each syllable of that terrible sound cracked through the cold air like invisible fireworks. I told her I agreed. And thanked her for taking my side. Though the land was not sold to the two men in lab coats, Fatima kept her end of the bargain. Over the next half a year, my grandfather's homestead transformed once again. What was once a humble family resort became the detox zone. The walls got brighter, the decor took on a distinctly New Age aesthetic, and the tranquil whistling of the wind was replaced with constant meditation music. The look of the resort was wholly foreign to me, and I disliked the breed of entitled people that would replace our old clientele, but Fatima kept her promise fully. The detox zone brought in significantly more revenue than we ever saw before. I retreated to my cottage, saved up my share of the profits, and watched the resort grow at a distance. Every once in a while, Fatima would drop by for tea and tell me tales of the bizarre questions the tourists would ask. But our friendship was sporadic and only experienced in short bursts. My cousin, on the other hand, would be at my cottage just about every week with a new bottle of expensive liquor. With every visit, he would reveal more plans for expansion and new avenues for his money to grow. Every visit, he offered to take me along for his investment adventures, and every visit, I declined. There were moments when his talk of wealth and luxury had me doubting my resolve. But I am happy I kept my money safe. Were I to join him on his financial misadventures, I too would have ended up destitute. My cousin made some bad investments. A sizable chunk of his money went towards a locally produced hair loss product. In the same breath that he would bemoan all the lawsuits and his imminent financial ruin, the man would still swear by the hair cream. A lot of money was sunk. Some serious people were involved. My cousin needed cash quick. He didn't even ask. One morning, I simply found Professor Willow peeking into the window of my cottage. He had his face pressed up against the glass as if he were trying to spot an animal in a zoo. When he saw that I saw him, Willow's eyes filled with malicious glee. He grinned and waved and stood still for nigh a minute, and then he left. I barely pulled on my coat when my cousin barged into the room. He had made a deal, he assured me. A good payout. A really good payout. For the both of us, with a nice holiday bonus for Bedtime. Willow offered him considerably better money, and, since he knew I didn't want to leave the property, he even secured me ownership over the cottage. Willow was just going to house scientists. It would be a calmer affair than the rich hippies. My cousin assured me that what he did was necessary and that I had no right to be angry with him. I didn't argue. I was angry, but my cousin looked to be on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I had seen the sort of business partners my cousin had. I knew he had little choice. I was displeased with my cousin's handling of the property, but by evening, I found some solace in the idea of housing scientists. They would be, I hoped, a quiet bunch. I went to sleep that night, presuming my life would not change much. Soon enough, however, I would meet the burnt people. It wasn't long after the detox zone cleared out that I started to feel uneasy at night. Back when the resort was still functional, there would be outdoor lighting to make sure none of the tourists stumble off into the wilderness. I quickly found myself missing those blinding lights. Each night, there was at least one moment I was certain someone was watching me from the darkness. According to the deal my cousin struck, I was still allowed access to my cottage, but the rest of the property was wholly off limits to me. The lobby of the resort was always guarded by a duo of tall men with shaved heads and a constant sneer on their face. At first, I thought I had simply witnessed two twins on the same shift, but as the days passed, I always saw the same two faces. Just as the thoughts of how many of the same specimen might be employed as security, the guards were given helmets and their identity was obscured. Another construction crew arrived at the resort a couple of weeks after the guards appeared. The crew was much quieter than anyone else who had ever worked on the property, and they would actively ignore me when I tried to make idle chatter. At first, I presumed that the crew was there to make adjustments to the resort rooms, yet very little of the original structure was touched. Instead, the work crew erected large black sheets above the resort, as if they were trying to hide something from satellites. The guards wouldn't say a word to me, and my cousin would never answer his phone. I was worried about what was happening on my grandfather's property. I was also worried about the lengthening absence of any communication with my cousin. What I truly should have worried about were the occupants of the new detox zone. The sound of footsteps on gravel woke me up. It couldn't have been more than 5:30. The sun was barely up. Were it not for the light sleep from the stress, I wouldn't have even woken up. They were walking right by my window. At first, I thought I was still half in dream. Yet there were many of them, and the sight of them quickly sobered me. Outside of my window, in a single file line, walked dozens of scientists. They wore clean lab coats, and some of them even had spectacles, but they all had the complexion of corpses. The scientists were burnt beyond recognition. With some, their flesh was merely seared. With others, it was charcoal black. None of them looked like they should be walking. Most of them looked like they shouldn't be breathing. Out of a sheer sense of disbelief, I rose from bed and peered closely from the window. I had hoped that the terrible state of the procession would have just been some sinister trick of the light. It wasn't. Not only were there charred corpses walking by my window, they were also looking back at me. Some of them had eyes, most of them did not. None of them stopped. They all had their heads turned towards me, but they still walked on in their single-file line. It was only the last scientist of the procession that properly acknowledged me. The man's eyeballs were shriveled, but I could not help but meet them. With a long, charred finger, he tapped on the glass. And then, with something that resembled a furrowed brow, he shook his head. I hid in my cottage until I was sure he was gone. Then, as quickly as humanly possible, I raced to my car and drove off to the city. I tried desperately to get a hold of my cousin. His phone was off. When I went to the hotel he used to stay at whenever he had business in the city, the receptionist said she had not seen him in months. I called Fatima. She met me a couple hours later at a cafe in the center. She still had a couple hooks in her, but most of her jewelry was gone. Fatima was muted, and not soon after we sat down, she explained why. She had heard things about my cousin through the grapevine. Most likely he had lost more than money in his hair product deal. Fatima presumed the reason why I wanted to meet was because of my cousin. Though the confirmation of my fears stung, the events of the morning were much more pressing. Lowering my voice in an effort to contain my sanity, I told her about the burnt scientists. She listened without any judgment. Even when I talked about the charred cadaver tapping on my window, her face didn't twitch. She simply nodded, smoked her cigarettes, and took long sips of coffee whenever I struggled for words. I presume your opinion on the stories of what happens in the forest has changed, she finally said, when my terrible tale concluded. I nodded. You aren't the only one, she said, as she finished off her coffee. We made some good money with the detox zone. I would suggest you take that money and move away from the property as soon as possible. You can't enjoy that money when you're dead. You can't enjoy that money when you're living near the Chilimiquanderba. The name of that terrible place once again crackled in the wind. I did not need Fatima's advice to convince me. All her words did was assure me that I am not insane. I spent the next week in the city, taking a room in the hotel where my cousin once lived. For the first few days, I made more attempts at calling him, yet his phone remained off. Eventually, I made peace with the likelihood of him no longer being among the living. After a week of hiding, in the middle of the day, I made the drive back to my grandfather's property. I was not planning on spending the night, or any extended amount of time in the cottage. All I wanted to do was to gather my belongings so that I would never need to see the place again. I, however, was not welcome. The mute guards met my car well before I entered the property. They said nothing and let the tips of their rifles draw all conclusions. I did not argue. I did not try to make my way back to the cottage to gather my belongings. I did not try to make my way back to the cottage, for it was burnt to the ground. But if you think the scares are over, you're in for a sinister surprise. I stayed out at the lake. Too late on an evening of a new moon. I was told to be off the land before sundown. The park ranger was very adamant that I had to be gone by then tonight, because that's when the park closed. He really emphasized tonight, which I thought was strange, but I followed his rule. I was the only person fishing the lake. It was beautiful, and the fish were still biting, but I turned back plenty early. It was a decent walk on the trail because of the way the trail winds around the outer part of the property. I just got back to the truck when several vehicles pulled up to the parking area. What the hell? I said out loud. I could see the ranger in the entrance gate building, and he just let them through. Then several more came in. So much for the park closing by sundown. All the people getting out of the vehicles were elderly folks. I thought, what the hell do these old people need the whole park for? It's a state park. They don't deserve the whole thing. I remember thinking some of these small-town people around here think they own all this, but we all do, right? So, F 'em. I grabbed my stuff and headed back out to the lake. I had time to get some more good fishing in. I figured no one would even notice I'm there, and I really wanted to bring home some keepers. God, I wish I could have just left. On my way back, I decided to go off the trail and cut through a part of the forest. I remember thinking, is this a good idea? Then continuing on anyway. It really wasn't that bad at first, and I wasn't carrying that much other than a pole, a small tackle box, and a bucket. Though the fish were biting, they weren't big enough to bother bringing home, so my bucket was empty. The walk started to seem like it was taking a little too long when I noticed the sun was completely gone. The sky was black. It was a clear night, and there were stars, but there was no moon. As I went further, the ground was more and more covered in brush. It was tripping me up. With no light except for stars, only feeling my way through. It was like sinking deeper and deeper. Everything seemed larger, or I felt smaller, but I continued on as my instinct told me to. I got a strange chill, and I stopped, froze completely, then I threw my gear down and froze again. Everything was silent for a moment. Then I heard a cracking noise. Probably a small animal, I thought. I heard the same noise, but a little louder and closer. Then crunching and crackling surrounded me, and a large dark figure, the size of a tree, raised from the ground around me. It was like the forest was a giant moving being that had awakened, suddenly and angrily. A deep, low growl followed the crunching noise of the branches that were enclosing me. And then I was running, my feet taking me so quickly I couldn't comprehend it beginning. I don't remember the surroundings, just the feeling of the cool air and branches cutting against my face. Then, up a hill, a light. There was a small pavilion with lanterns around it and a few picnic tables. People were all around talking casually. It was the old people I had seen earlier. The tables were set up with food and drinks. It was so surreal, but I was too panicked to care. I tried to speak, but was too out of breath. "Whoa, where'd you come from?" one person said. Still out of breath, I tried to reply. "Sorry, couldn't understand you, buddy," he said before turning away from me, continuing to his conversation with the others at this gathering. It was all very odd and frustrating. Then I gathered myself enough to speak. "There is something," I said while pointing to the woods. Now they all paused their conversations and are looking at me curiously. "Something big is out there," I said, but confusingly to me they all started smiling. I was irritated by them, thinking that they thought I was crazy. "What are you all doing out here anyway? You've got to listen to me," I said. I glanced around at them as they just stared at me. Then they all started moving in a little closer. Okay. One of them said in a trying to be calming but condescending way. His hands motioned a let's bring it down kind of motion. I was annoyed and looked away from him and glanced over at their picnic table. A shiver went down my spine. That's when I actually got a look at what was on the table. It looked like raw meat. Hunks of flesh in foil pans and Tupperware containers. One with scalps, hair hanging over the side of it, and part of a human face inside it. They lunged toward me and pulled me to the ground with strength and speed unbelievable for the look of them. An old woman in a giddy voice said, "Our meager offering just got a little more tantalizing." The deep growl came out of the forest behind them, louder this time than before. They turned and I broke free and ran. "No!" yelled that woman that was so giddy before, but a man stopped her and snapped, "We have no time, get into place." From a distance, I watched a giant figure dark as the night emerge, horns or branches coming from it at all sides. They gathered to the sides of the pavilion, showing their offering. A man stepped forward and said, "Our Lord of the New Moon, please accept our offering for another month of youth." The figure engulfed the pavilion, but must not have been satisfied. The man that spoke screamed, and I could see blood gushing everywhere, as if he were squeezed. I ran, found my way to the trail, sprinted the whole way to the parking lot, got in my truck, and sped off. About a week has passed, and that night all seemed like nothing more than a dream. A really messed up dream. In fact, my luck has been pretty good since then. Work is going good. I work in an auto shop, and my boss hasn't been up my ass all week like he usually is. I won $50 on a scratcher. Not much, but I'll take it. And I hit it off with this girl who brought her car in, which never happens to me. All seemed great in my week, which really had me questioning what I saw. At dinner, me and Heather, the girl I met earlier, were really getting along. She laughed at all my jokes, which is always a good sign, since they really aren't that funny. Everything was great. Something about her seemed almost familiar. We were talking about where the rest of the night should take us. Then she said, "We could just head over to my place." I was all in. Then she said, At home, I can change into this new thing I bought. I was choking on my words, just nodding. Then she said, "It might be a little more tantalizing," with a giggle. The life fled from my body. Her voice, the word tantalizing, the way she said it, it was her. This was the old woman that was in the woods. They knew where to find me. They are probably going to kill me because of what I've seen. I'm in the restroom of the restaurant now. I think she might know that I know. My exit was less than graceful. I've peeked out the door to see if anyone else is watching, but I don't know. I don't know who to trust. That's why I'm reaching out for someone to believe me. I don't know who I know that will actually believe me. FML. I'm afraid I might be kidnapped and fed to some woodland beast. Think you can handle more? The next story will truly test your courage. The Day I Lost My Wings, Part 1, series. Of all of the living people involved in this story, I'm the only one who didn't see a single thing until it was far too late. Any of the others would be more qualified to tell it, but here we are, over a decade later, and none of them really feel like talking. Can't say I blame them. But for reasons that will be apparent much, much later, I feel like someone has to tell people, and until somebody else writes something better, this account will have to do. Being a pilot isn't like you imagine it'll be when you're a kid. It's stressful, the hours are weird, and whilst the constant travel is exciting, it also makes holding down a long-term relationship incredibly difficult. It's common not to seek professional help for stress, bereavement, or trauma for fears that you'll be diagnosed with anxiety or depression. A diagnosis that gives you a fun choice between being grounded for months at a minimum or lying on the next medical and facing a fine and jail time. You can go to beautiful new countries and be too tired and busy to even get a look around. And whilst I don't think that flight crews are necessarily more prone to drama than any other profession, it can get intense fast. But I loved it. It seems childish to say, but if the flight I'm about to recount had never happened, then I probably would have been flying until my body or brain were no longer up to the task, whichever gave up first. It just feels like where I'm meant to be. Not in some deep spiritual sense, but more the quiet kind of, "Ah yes, this is correct," that some people might get when clicking the final piece into a jigsaw puzzle or cooking a particularly satisfying bowl of pasta. That day was no different. I pushed the throttles forwards and everything felt fine. We picked up speed and everything felt normal. Mark called out to let me know we'd reached 80 knots and everything felt normal. Hell, not even normal. Things were good. There were no real crosswinds to speak of, and whilst Mark had used aftershave, he hadn't practically showered in it like the last guy I'd flown with, so that was a welcome relief. Given that I'm not meant to be telling you anything at all, I can't afford to give away too many details about the flight itself. It was a smaller plane, I don't see any harm in saying that, and a route I'd flown before. The first hour of the flight was pleasant. Mark telling me about a Greek mythology series I hadn't seen, and me segueing this almost seamlessly, well, maybe a little seamfully, into a book I'd read last year that also dealt with mythology in modern times. We actually both wanted different food than each other, so there was no awkward discussion as to who was going to get the better option. Utterly nothing interesting happened, but why would I need it to? At that stage of a flight, interesting was just another word for bad, and Mark was lively enough conversation that I wasn't getting bored. "I'm changing careers," Mark said out of nowhere. "I'm going to become a flight attendant. In fact, I think I'll start right now. I'm going to go and trade places with Ava. I'm sure she can fly fine." What?" I asked, utterly lost. "I'm going to get Ava to come join you so I can go and take a piss." Oh. Shortly after, Mark had disappeared and been switched with a woman who definitely wasn't Ava. "I thought Mark said he was switching with Ava," I commented as Karen came to join me. "Disappointed?" "Not even slightly," I said, and I meant it. "Ava's boyfriend is on this flight, and so she wanted to keep chatting with him," Karen explained. "Young love, isn't it just sickening?" The warm grin on Karen's face made it incredibly clear that she didn't find it anywhere near as annoying as she was pretending to, and probably wasn't even bothered. "How is it back there?" I asked. Fine. Talked with Ava's new boyfriend, who has apparently heard all about Me from that landlord issue I helped Ava with a few months back, and I had to pretend I knew all about him too, so that's always fun. There's a couple of weird guys in suits who have handed out books, and I had to spend at least 10 minutes figuring out who'd switch places with a guy who couldn't sit where he was because of the perfume of the woman next to him. Problem being that both him and the woman were making such a fuss that everyone around knew why he wanted to move, and so it wasn't an easy sell. Was he allergic? No, he just said it smelled too bad to be next to. Did it? Karen pulled a face. It wasn't great. Mark would undoubtedly be taking his time to stretch his legs and possibly even try to catch up with Ava before he headed back to the cockpit. Technically, he shouldn't be gone any longer than needed, but walking around to stretch out his legs could be argued as necessary, and he was almost never gone so long that I actually begrudged him the break. What's weird about the suit men? I asked Karen. Are the suits odd or something else? Well, they've given everyone on the plane a book, so that's pretty weird. The books are really small, but even so their bags must have been stuffed with them. What's in the book? Karen shrugged. I didn't get one, they were just handed out to the passengers. There's nothing on the front of them, and when I asked Tyler what was in it, he said it looked like nonsense. Tyler? Ava's boyfriend. Come on now, Kay. Karen cut herself off as I moved to let Mark back in. What's with the yellow books? He asked her before she left. No idea, I've already told Matt all I know. Mark looked at me questioningly. So are the books a religious thing then? I don't know, maybe. He had no further questions, and so I thought that was that. Karen came back to the cockpit 10 minutes later, which was notable in itself. For those who haven't flown much, or have just never really noticed, the cockpit isn't somewhere that anyone can freely wander in and out of. Outside of certain very specific circumstances, the door doesn't even open from the passenger side of the plane without permission from one of the pilots. And Karen's claim that she had a letter for us was extremely suspicious. It wasn't what she would say to us if she was being threatened, though, and so, perhaps against better judgment, we let her in. To my surprise, Karen actually was holding a letter in her hands. Nobody was stood next to her to try and force their way in as I'd feared, but she looked shaken. It's for either of you, she said as she went to hand me the letter, only to jerk it back at the last second. Actually, maybe I should hold it for you to read. What, you think it's laced with arsenic? Mark joked. Just don't touch it. Why? Mark asked. Because I've read it, and it's weird. Karen isn't an easy woman to shake up. Being a flight attendant is her second stab at life. Something I learned after admitting to her that I wished I gave as few fucks in life as she did. Well, you try being married to a monster for 2 decades, and maybe it'll sort you out too, was what she'd told me at the time. And as we'd had time to talk, she'd given me a cliff notes of the whole Sorry saga. As well as a relentless enthusiasm when it came to trying new things, she also credited being married to an abuser with her complete lack of patience with bullies. After the things that her ex-husband had done to her when she'd felt utterly trapped and alone, the things any future bully would do when she had the power to walk away or scream at them, just seemed toothless in comparison. Or to quote her directly, "What are they going to do, marry me?" Mark and I read the letter in silence. I don't have a copy and probably can't remember it word for word, but the gist of it was that the letter writer wanted us to divert the plane in order to move some cargo. If we chose not to, people would die. If we chose to land in a different airport, people would die. If we even contacted anybody on land, people would die. The letter writer said that the first person would die in 10 minutes, and as a show of good faith and their commitment to the cause, it would be one of their group. After that, every 10 minutes it would be someone new, chosen at random. If the letter writer was killed or knocked out, then this would not stop new people from dying. The only way that letter writer would let us all live was if we fulfilled his demands entirely. Then, at the bottom of the letter, a latitude and longitude. What the fuck? Mark whispered. Karen folded the note back into her pocket. It's from the men with the suits and the books. Mark stood up. Well, I'm gonna have a talk with them then. Tie them up and tell them not to menace people on our fucking plane. No, Karen said firmly. You both need to stay here in case and they're both already tied up now. What? How? Mark asked. I don't know if I believe that Mark could physically restrain two men by himself. He's undoubtedly a strong man. He goes to the gym as often as he gets a chance to. But 2 against 1 doesn't sound like great odds. Karen, however, finds the gym boring, and whilst she is fit enough to go on infrequent hikes and dabble in other physical pursuits, she doesn't look particularly strong. They just let me, Karen said, seemingly taking no offense at the question. I got some cable ties, and they offered their wrists up and told me that they aren't armed anyway. They were polite, and I don't like it. I haven't lost it, but I think something bad's going to happen. I hadn't been keeping track as to how long since we'd gotten the letter. How many minutes until the first person would supposedly die? If you don't need me, then I'm going back to watch them, Karen said, and I nodded in agreement. So do we tell someone? Mark asked once she'd left. I shook my head slowly. No, not because it says not to, but what would we even say? An unarmed, essentially handcuffed man has claimed that he will kill his friend? Something he can magically do even if we knock him out? Mark looked uncomfortable. We're really just going to wait and see? I guess. We've no air marshal, and given that both of these people are tied up, I don't even know what one would do aside from look more threatening than Karen. I guess we wait. We didn't have to wait long. He's dead. We could tell from Karen's expression that she hadn't come back with good news. Maybe he's just fainted or something, Mark asked hopefully. For fuck's sake, no. He's dead. I moved him to the floor to do CPR, and Ava got a doctor from the passengers, so he's even been officially pronounced dead. He just... My head was spinning, and for a moment I was worried I was going to throw up. Enid? I only caught the end of Mark's question. Karen breathed in deeply before she answered, and when she spoke, she had her eyes closed. The dead man looked perfectly fine and was just staring ahead of himself. Then he slumped forwards, and the other man looked at his watch, and then he looked at me. He said something like, being sorry we were out of time. Karen opened her eyes again and looked at us both. Cyanide? Mark asked. How would I even know what that looks like, Mark? But there was no frothing like when they bite the pills in films. Wait, what time was on his watch? I yelled. Nobody answered me, but we all reached similar conclusions at the same time. Since the man had died, he had received some CPR, been pronounced dead, and we'd had this entire conversation. Even if all of this had taken under 10 minutes so far, we couldn't have long left. Karen sped to leave the cockpit, and all Mark and I could really do was wait. It happened again. The intercom told us, the nightmare doesn't end here. It only gets worse with this next story. I was never one to believe in ghost stories. The so-called legends, local folklore, all that stuff. To me, it was just a way for people to make life in a small town seem a little more exciting. But if there's one thing I know now, it's that some mysteries are better left untouched. I learned that the hard way on a chilly night in Shenandoah National Park back in October 1999. It was one of those cold evenings when the mist rolls in so thick you can barely see 5 feet in front of you. Shenandoah's isolated valleys could be beautiful, but in that gray fog, they felt cold and lifeless. I'd been assigned to the area as a park ranger only a few months prior, so I was still getting to know the trails. My supervisor, Bill, had given me a late shift that day, telling me to keep an eye out for anything unusual. I scoffed. Unusual? In Shenandoah? The place was a ghost town after sunset. I was wrapping up my patrol when I saw something out of place. It was just off the path, hidden beneath some brush. At first glance, I thought it might be a pile of garbage left by some careless camper, but as I got closer, I realized it was an animal. A fox, to be specific. The strange thing was, it looked like it had been laid out, not as though it had just died naturally. Its limbs were arranged in an eerie, deliberate circle, like some sort of twisted display. The air felt thick and still as I looked around, my heart suddenly pounding a bit faster. I was trained to be calm under pressure. My military days had taught me that much. But standing in the middle of a foggy valley with a dead fox arranged in a perfect circle, I felt a chill I couldn't shake. I radioed in to let Bill know I'd found something strange. Probably just some weird prank, he said, his voice crackling over the static. Teenagers like to mess around out there, but check around, just in case. I nodded, more to myself than to him, and kept moving, scanning the ground with my flashlight. A few yards away, I found something even more unsettling. A small, mud-splattered shoe. A child's shoe. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was scratched, and the fabric was torn in places. As I scanned the ground further, my flashlight caught on something else. A small, torn-up backpack, the kind with bright cartoon characters that kids would carry. I crouched down, my pulse thundering as I realized it wasn't just scratched. It was ripped, as if there'd been a struggle. I'd heard the stories before, of course. Every ranger knew them. The valley's spirit child, they called her. A little girl who, according to local lore, had drowned in the river ages ago. The legend went that she wandered the valley at night, searching for friends to play with. I had laughed it off, as most of us did. But standing there, holding that tiny shoe, I felt like the fog around me was pressing in, chilling me to the bone. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a kid who got lost or someone's idea of a prank. But then I heard it. A faint giggle, soft and lilting, floating through the mist. It was almost playful, like a child hiding just out of sight. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in every direction. The forest was silent, the trees unmoving in the thick fog. The only sound was my own breath, shallow and unsteady. And then, just on the edge of my vision, I saw her. A small, pale figure standing a few yards away, half concealed by the trees. She wore a tattered white dress that looked like it hadn't been touched by time, her hair falling messily around her shoulders. Her eyes met mine, and I felt an icy fear I hadn't known since combat. I tried to speak, to ask her if she was lost, but the words died in my throat. The girl stared at me, unblinking, her gaze piercing through the fog. And then, in a blink, she was gone. I looked around wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the mist, thick and silent, as if it had swallowed her whole. My hand was shaking as I reached for my flashlight, desperately trying to reassure myself it was just my imagination. But then I felt it. Cold fingers wrapping around my wrist. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. I looked down, and what I saw nearly made my heart stop. Dozens of tiny handprints covered my arm, smeared as though they'd been pressed into the very fabric of my jacket. I yanked my hand back, stumbling a few steps, the giggle returning, louder this time, echoing in the silence around me. I didn't wait to see what came next. I ran, stumbling through the brush, my breath ragged and heart hammering as that eerie laughter followed me, soft and mocking. Even when I finally reached the path, I didn't stop. I ran until I reached the station, locking the door behind me, as if that would keep whatever was out there from following me. I told Bill about what I'd seen, but he just shrugged it off, said I was probably overtired or maybe just falling for the old local stories. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And to this day, I don't go back to that valley. Every so often, though, I'll hear the other rangers talk about strange things they've seen out there. The laughter they hear in the mist, the things that disappear when you look away. And every time I hear it, I remember those cold fingers gripping my wrist and the pale face of that little girl watching me through the fog. I don't know what she wanted or why she let me go, but I don't think she'll stop looking for friends anytime soon. But the shadows hide even darker secrets, and you're about to uncover them. I've always felt at home in the forest. There's something comforting about the quiet rustle of leaves, the smell of damp soil, the towering redwoods stretching up to the sky. Growing up near California's Redwood National Park, I've spent more hours in these woods than anywhere else. For nearly a decade, I worked a park ranger here. It was never just a job. The forest was part of who I was. My name is Ben Rios, and this is the story I've never told anyone. Not fully, anyway. It was late afternoon when the first sign of trouble began. I'd been tracking a family of deer that had gone missing from a nearby area. Normally, I'd chalk it up to some natural predator, but something felt off. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Usually, you could hear squirrels scampering or birds chirping, but today, nothing. Just silence. It's hard to explain if you haven't spent much time in the woods, but the quiet felt heavy, like the air was thick and pushing down on me. Thunder rumbled in the distance. It was strange weather for December, but coastal storms weren't unheard of. I glanced up, catching the faint flicker of lightning through the canopy. The storm was still a ways off, but I'd learned not to underestimate them. With the last bit of daylight slipping away, I decided to head back to the main trail and call it a night. That's when I stumbled upon the clearing. I'd never seen it before, which was strange. I knew these woods like the back of my hand. It wasn't marked on any map, and it shouldn't have been there. I almost walked past it, but something pulled me in. The ground was littered with bones, small and large, scattered like someone had tossed them around carelessly. Animal bones, mostly, but some looked wrong. I couldn't place it, but a cold shiver ran down my spine as I looked closer. A sickly sweet odor hung in the air, mixing with something sharp, almost metallic. The smell was nauseating, and I found myself covering my mouth, trying not to gag. Then my flashlight flickered. I smacked it a few times, but it sputtered and died, leaving me in near darkness. I took out my backup, but it wouldn't turn on either. It was like the batteries had been drained all at once. A sinking feeling took hold in my stomach, and the hair on my arms stood up. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt frozen. I started to hear a faint rustling. It was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, like something was shifting in the underbrush around me. My heart began to pound as I scanned the area, hoping to catch sight of whatever was making the noise, but the fog had started to roll in thick and heavy, clouding everything. I took a step back, and that's when I saw them, the handprints. They were smeared across the trunks of nearby trees, dark and sticky like tar. Each handprint was massive, far larger than any human's. My first thought was a bear, but bears don't leave prints like that, especially not ones that looked almost human. I thought of the old legends, stories my grandfather told me as a kid about forest giants. He'd say that the forest had spirits, ancient beings who guarded the land and didn't take kindly to trespassers. I always laughed it off back then. But standing there, with those handprints looming over me, I started to wonder if the stories were more than just tales meant to scare kids. Another rumble of thunder snapped me out of my thoughts, and I decided I needed to leave. Now, I turned to go, but the rustling grew louder, and I could see a shadow shifting between the trees, tall and moving with an eerie, unnatural grace. My legs felt heavy as I forced myself to walk, keeping my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look back. But then I heard it, my name. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. Ben. The voice was deep, like the groaning of the trees, and it seemed to come from all around me. I broke into a sprint, heart racing, barely able to see where I was going in the thickening fog. Just as I thought I'd made it back to the trail, I felt something behind me. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. A massive, clawed hand, reaching out from the darkness. I stumbled and fell, scrambling to get back on my feet, adrenaline propelling me forward. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees finally thinned and the fog lifted. I turned back, expecting to see something lurking there, but all I saw were trees swaying gently in the wind. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was real or if the silence and the storm played tricks on my mind. But I swear, just as I was catching my breath, I heard the faintest whisper carried on the wind, calling my name one last time. The forest hasn't felt the same to me since. Some nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear the trees whispering, like they remember me, and they're waiting. If you think the worst is behind us, you're about to be proven wrong. I'm always hungry, but everything tastes like ash. Autumn arrived fully and in its entire gray glory on a simple Friday, and I hated it. I had to stay late for a party at the office to spend time with people I didn't like and hardly knew yet. And, as I finally found the moment to say my goodbyes and left the building, I was smacked in the face by rain carried over on a harsh, howling wind. Cursing myself for forgetting an umbrella, I jumped out and looked for the next subway station. I was still quite new to this town and had to find my way around. My glasses were just as wet as my phone, which didn't help much to find the right direction. The surrounding lights of the shops and bars shone in the puddles on the ground. I tried my best to avoid them, but failed twice, and my sneakers were soaked and muddy. My grumbling stomach didn't help with the very bad mood I already had. I had filled up on more liquid than food at the party, hoping it would push me to socialize a little. It didn't. As I was just about to lose my nerves and call a cab, I saw it. The place that would become my sanctuary and my hell. Frankie's. The building itself was nothing special, or at least nothing memorable. Yellow bricks or possibly gray concrete with windows on the higher floors. The ground floor, however, only had this big door with a wooden sign on top. Frankie's. Restaurant and bar was written in golden cursive letters that were lit up with a single light bulb on top of it. I can't tell you what led me to open the door, let alone walk inside, but before I knew what I was doing, I found myself in a small entrance hall. A hostess stood behind a wooden desk, and when her gaze dropped to my soaked clothes, she gave me a warm smile. She was dressed in an elegant black sweater and a skirt. "Table for one?" she asked. "Oh no, sorry," I started mumbling. "I came in by accident." She slowly shook her head. "You walked into a restaurant by accident?" And just as I looked for words to fill the silence, my stomach took initiative and let out a loud grumble. "I suppose your tummy doesn't think it was an accident," she giggled. "But you're in luck. We still have an empty table. It's just down the stairs." She gestured to her right, where a small hallway led to a spiraling staircase. I was just about to turn around and get away. Politeness be damned, because I did not see myself sitting in a restaurant completely soaked, especially as I didn't even know how expensive this place might be. But then the scent of roasted garlic and baked bread filled my nose, and before I could stop myself, I was moving towards the stairs. "Enjoy," the woman called after me. I'd never been to a restaurant in a basement before, and this place almost felt like a cave with its uneven stone walls. It should have felt suffocating, but instead, it was cozy and inviting. It was dim, most of the light came from individual candles on the tables, and soft piano music was being played by a man in the center of the room. The walls were adorned with dozens of paintings. A waiter dressed in a white shirt led me to my table. But as I sat down, the eyes of every person around turned to me. Everyone stopped talking, the soft tune of the piano the only sound. I caught the eyes of a woman at the table to my left, and she simply stared at me, not blinking once. Her mouth opened, and for a moment I thought she would say something to me, but instead her mouth only opened wider to reveal a set of rotten teeth. I blinked, and she tilted her head, giving me a smile with full red lips and no sign of rot. That's when the waiter placed a basket of bread in front of me, and the gazes of the people shifted again as the muffled conversations continued. It was nothing, just a trick of the light mixed with my muddled mind. "Thank you," I said to the man who filled my glass, and he nodded as he handed me a card. "I will be back in a moment to take your order," he said before heading to a different table. Surprisingly, the meals were very affordable, and everything sounded incredibly delicious. I ordered the honey-roasted salmon with rosemary potatoes and a house salad. After placing my order, I simply sat there, mesmerized by the light of the warm candle in front of me. Strangely, for the first time since I'd moved here, I felt at home, like I belonged. I forgot about the cold waiting for me outside, forgot about my wet clothes, and the terrible conversations I had with my colleagues. I was pulled away from my thoughts as the waiter placed my meal in front of me. The mouth-watering scents filled my nose, and I started digging in. Every bite tasted better than the one before, and I used the bread to soak up the last bits of sauce and oil on my plate. The waiter appeared again, and I ordered a chocolate lava cake for dessert. I'm not sure how much time had passed at that point, and I realized that I didn't care. I would have stayed there forever if I could, falling asleep with the sound of the piano. My cake was brought out with a shot of espresso I hadn't ordered. I finished my dessert and drank the coffee in one gulp. And that's when my heart started racing. The walls felt as if they were about to cave in. No matter how hard I tried, my lungs wouldn't fill with enough air. A look at my watch made me realize that 5 hours had passed. There was no way I had been eating for 5 fucking hours. I looked at the burning candle that hadn't shrunk one bit. I even touched it to make sure that it was real and burned my finger in the process. I quickly placed some notes on the table and practically ran up the stairs without looking at another person. The following morning, I still had no idea what had happened to me, but it took me hours until I was even remotely ready to get out of bed. The days after weren't much better. I felt constantly tired, agitated, and exhausted. But that wasn't the worst of it. I couldn't eat anymore. I'd try a piece of bread and would instantly taste mold on it and spit it out. Even my favorite meals tasted like ash in my mouth. Eventually, I had to resort to blending my food and physically force myself to swallow it. But even then, I would throw it back up most of the time. A week later, I was just on my way back from the gym near my home, hoping to get some energy back, when I suddenly noticed the same sign at the front of a building in a completely different part of town. Frankie's curiosity got the best of me, and I opened the door, just to be greeted by the exact same hostess of the other night. "Table for one?" she asked with a smirk, and before I knew what I was doing, I nodded and made my way down the stairs. I'd just started with my dinner when another guest came up to my table. "You're a regular now, aren't you?" He couldn't have been much older than me, late 20s or maybe early 30s, but his curly blonde hair and the freckles on his face gave him a slightly boyish look. "Excuse me?" I laughed nervously. He didn't even ask permission before sitting down in the seat in front of me, which usually stayed empty. "A regular visitor of the restaurant, though everyone here is," he winked. "What's your name?" "Leonard Erickson." Leonard Erickson. He repeated my name as if he was tasting every single syllable. "It is truly a pleasure to meet you." I smiled, and when he stayed silent for a while, I asked, "Are you going to tell me your name too?" He grinned. "Not today, Leo. Can I call you Leo?" I rolled my eyes and laughed. "Are you serious?" "Well, how about you call me Jack? It's not my name, but I'll answer to it." He shrugged. "You know, you seem really at ease for someone who is being lured into this place. A lot of people lose their calm much sooner." A hard lump formed in my throat, and it felt as if someone had poured ice water over my head. It was weird that I came back here, especially as I was in a completely different part of town, but I just felt so incredibly hungry. "Shh, it's okay. You haven't even finished your meal yet. It is easier if you simply ignore the wrongness. At least that's what I learned. I didn't mean to pull you out." "Out of what?" I whispered. "The experience?" he said with a sympathetic smile on his face. "You'll spend a lot of time here, Leo, so just so you know, you can interact with the people here. It might even help you to do so. Just be careful what you reveal about yourself." "What do you mean?" "I mean that some of the other guests here are very hungry. They are keeping away from you as you are still fresh, but that will change soon. Some hardly ever leave this place and long for a touch of the outside. Don't feed them too much. This is a restaurant. I'm sure they won't go hungry here. Not every type of hunger can be stilled with food, Leo." Before I could reply, he got off his seat, but I grabbed his arm on instinct. I still had so many questions, and I wanted to hear him speak for longer. I wanted to know more about him, but before I could do so, Jack's expression shifted into the one of a madman. He yanked his arm free, shoving his fists down on the table in front of me. He came close enough for me to feel the heat of his breath on my skin. In the dim light, his eyes appeared almost yellow as they were drilling into mine. "Don't ever touch me again," he hissed and turned away from me. This time I didn't try to stop him. I ate the rest of my meal in silence and didn't look for Jack, nor did I interact with anyone else. But I could swear that the eyes of every guest around me were glued to me the entire evening. "Welcome, Leonard. Table for one? Or would you like me to match you up with someone?" The friendly hostess greeted me the next time I found the restaurant somewhere it shouldn't and couldn't be. It'd been weeks, and I couldn't let go of Frankie's. My moments of clarity were few and far between at this point. I'd lost a lot of weight. I stopped going to work. Bills were piling up, but I couldn't make myself care. "Why do I keep coming back?" I asked, because she seemed to be one of the few slightly trustworthy ones. "I stopped asking myself that decades ago," she sighed. "Why can't I eat anything else anymore?" "Because all our ingredients are imported from a very special place. A very special town." She gave me that warm smile that always made me feel welcome. "That must be the most wonderful town in the world." She nodded. Frankie's became my dirty little secret. I couldn't meet friends over dinner or coffee anymore, because I couldn't consume anything from the outside. Nobody would have believed my story anyway, and if I was completely honest, I didn't want to share it. Frankie's was mine. I knew that for a fact because now it appeared to me almost daily, always at different places and usually when I needed it the most. Sometimes I wandered around town for hours just so I could find it. On days that I didn't, I wanted to gouge my own eyes out. I also started understanding what Jack was trying to tell me. Talking to other guests was, well, a very interesting form of torture and control. I had a conversation with an old lady. Her hair was spotty and gray. Her face was full of wrinkles. She reminded me of my grandmother, but without the kindness. A few times I would catch glimpses of rot in her. For example, there were holes all over her arm, which I tried not to focus on, even though they made my own skin itch. I told her some stories about my youth, how I was an only child and always had a love for comic books. I tried to stay vague because I knew she was stealing from me, but I'd become lonely, starving for conversations that I couldn't have anymore on the outside, because people started looking at me strangely. "I've been coming here for years," she said, and a tooth fell right out of her mouth into the glass of wine in front of her. I swallowed thickly but didn't comment on it. "Do you remember much about your past?" I asked, and her expression turned dark. She shook her head and asked more questions about myself. At the end of our conversation, I was looking at a beautiful woman who couldn't have been older than 30, showing me a bright, white smile. I knew at that moment that she'd been stealing from me because the memories of my childhood slowly started disappearing. It hadn't been my intention to share so much, but somehow I'd forgotten all about Jack's warning over the delicious ratatouille I'd been enjoying. She got ready to get up, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her closer to my face. "Give them back," I hissed. Her eyes turned entirely white and she bared her teeth. "No, it's your own fault. You're so dumb." I got up from my seat and took her face into my hands, digging in my nails until I drew blood. I knew I wasn't myself at that moment because I pulled my hands back and started tasting the blood on them. Her expression shifted and she quickly hurried away, but I knew it had worked because some of my memories came back to me. I sat back down with a happy grin and got ready to order my dessert when I noticed a familiar face opposite of me. I didn't even see him approaching. "Hi, Leo," he grinned. "Hello, Jack. How have you been?" "Terrible and also fantastic," I answered truthfully. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. "You do look kind of terrible, if I'm honest. I'm sorry this happened to you." I wasn't sure what he meant. I wasn't sorry. I needed Frankie's more than I needed to breathe. It filled a gap I didn't even realize I had before finding it. "You know, I've been watching you," he continued. "You hardly fed on anyone, and that made me sad. I feel a connection to you, did it the first time we met. And I hoped you wouldn't wither away so soon, but it looks like you're finally starting to fight back." His praise filled me with a warm feeling, and I knew I wanted more of it, but I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed silent. "You know that you can never stop coming here, right?" "I don't want to stop," I said truthfully, even though something inside of me screamed that that wasn't right. "But if I did stop, I would starve to death, and I'd already lost too much of myself." "Good, because I have a proposition for you. I need someone to visit the town where we get our supplies, and most people here have already lost too much of themselves to leave for a longer time. Would you be willing to make the trip? Don't worry. When you get back, the most magnificent meal will be waiting for you." I thought about it for a moment. Leaving town would mean leaving Frankie's, and whatever that place was, it couldn't be good. But I had a feeling that declining wasn't an option. "Where would that be?" I asked carefully. He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A place that smells like cinnamon and death."